The man known to history as Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born in the Marienbad Sanatorium on the 12th of January 1893. Göring was born in the town of Rosenheim in the Kingdom of Bavaria to Heinrich Ernst Göring and Franziska Tiefenbrunn. Göring's father, Heinrich, had already been married once and had 5 children. He would marry Tiefenbrunn at the age of 45 in London, having been sent there by Otto von Bismarck on assignment to study the British method of colonial administration. Before studying British colonial administration methods, he served as a cavalry officer in the Bavarian army, and following his studies, he was reassigned to the oversight of German territories in Southwest Africa. Heinrich's time as Minister-Resident for Southwest Africa would be relatively short, as he would soon be appointed the Ambassador of Haiti. Hermann Göring's mother, Franziska Tiefenbrunn, had given birth to 3 other children, Karl, Olga and Paula, before Hermann, and when Göring was born, his mother returned to Haiti without him, leaving him in Frut, Bavaria, with a family friend, and for the next 3 years, Göring would live with the Gauff family, holding much resentment for his mother for leaving him behind. So much so that when they finally reunited in 1896 and she tried to give him a hug, Göring ran at his mother, trying to punch her for leaving him for so long. Subsequently, the family moved to Berlin and lived in Fregestrasse in the Friedenau suburb, and from a very early age, Göring wanted to become an officer in the German military, just like his father. The family dynamic shifted dramatically during Göring's childhood as his father's friend Dr. Hermann Eppenstein, who was Hermann's godparent, spoiled the Göring children, and when Dr. Eppenstein returned to Germany, he bought the castle Mautendorf in Austria, not far from the Bavarian border. He would also buy a second, smaller castle called Feldenstein, near the city of Nuremberg. Göring would come to see Feldenstein become the family's seat of nobility, yet this was only possible due to his affluent godfather. Dr. Eppenstein was also friendly with Franziska, and she would become Eppenstein's mistress, humiliating her frail husband, as when Eppenstein visited, he would be given the finest bedroom, with Franziska's bedroom not far away, while Heinrich was placed on the ground floor and was forbidden from entering that part of the castle. He would take little to no part in raising Göring, as Dr. Eppenstein took over the care of the children. Dr. Eppenstein was a Christian, as he had been baptized as a child, yet his family's roots were Jewish. He would often write to the Görings about directing their children's lives in areas such as education, marriage, and investments. While Göring's father was obsessed with his past glory, his godfather embodied true power, yet Göring resented the relationship between Eppenstein and his mother. He was spoiled as a child and received little discipline, stating he was "daddy's darling." He was a difficult pupil and left his first school in Frut in 1900, and in 1904 he was sent to boarding school in Ansbach, which he hated, so much so that he spent his last change on a ticket home, whilst making sure to cut all the stringed instruments before leaving. His parents insisted he go back to school, but he stubbornly resisted. He was unable to cope with the restrictions placed upon him at Ansbach, and he believed his defiance towards authority figures was a sign of natural heroism. His father said historical greatness ran through their blood, and this saying would inspire Göring towards a grand vision. In 1905, it was agreed upon by his father and Eppenstein to send him to the cadet school in Karlsruhe in Baden. Ironically, the two did not anticipate Göring's positive response to the idea of attending the academy, as he thought it was finally a school fit for a hero. By 1909, he enrolled into a military training college at Lichterfelde near Berlin. He enjoyed the daily regime of military life and also his solitary nights spent alone. He left Lichterfelde with the highest distinction available at the academy, and by March of 1912 he had joined the Prince Wilhelm Regiment. He would be part of the 112th Infantry Regiment stationed at Mulhouse, and by 1913 Göring would become a commissioned officer. It would be only a year later that the tenuous friendship with Eppenstein would end in 1913, forcing the family from Feldenstein. As a result, Heinrich moved the family to Berlin, and shortly afterwards passed away. Though the loss of his father was devastating, Goering settled into life at Mulhouse and became friends with Lieutenant Bruno Lürzer. Mulhouse was a border garrison town in German Alsace, with no more than a mile separating Germany and France. Meanwhile, in Sarajevo, the Austro-Hungarian heir apparent to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, had been assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a member of Young Bosnia, in 1914. This assassination resulted in the July Crisis, which saw the diplomatic relationship of European countries deteriorate. When war was declared, Lieutenant Goering and his men were ordered to retreat behind the Rhine to take up a better defensive position, and the French quickly took the town. One of Goering's first missions would be to provide a scouting report of the French position in Mulhouse, although Goering, eager in the heat of the moment, pushed the French out of the town. He captured 4 French dragoon horses and returned to base with his war prizes. On the following day, Goering and his platoon entered the town on bicycles and engaged the French troops in a skirmish, sending them into a panic. Goering's success led him to concoct a plan to capture General Paul Pau, but a nervous rifleman gave away their position when he misfired his gun. With their position compromised, the platoon returned back to base empty-handed, leaving Goering bitter about his lost opportunity to gain instant fame. Goering became an experienced and reliable junior officer, but would be unexpectedly struck down with rheumatism. He was sent to a hospital in Freiburg to recover and kept in touch with Lürzer, who had entered into an air training school. Goering applied for a transfer to the training school, but was denied. Despite the official denial, Goering took the matter into his own hands by arranging his own transfer to be trained as an aviator. Goering would be court-martialed for his actions, but was never punished, as he was attached to the 25th Field Air Detachment of Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm's Fifth Army. The two friends carried out reconnaissance missions, which required photographing and drawing the enemy's entrenchment and gun placements. The two became legends, as Goering drew the chain of forts surrounding Verdun and shot at enemies with a pistol when Lürzer flew low enough. The pair would be awarded the first-class Iron Cross for their bravery. Flying reconnaissance took up much of Goering's spring in 1915, and he eventually learned Morse code, enabling him to send messages down to the base whilst in the sky. The first Morse code message he sent was, quote, "You can stop firing, you won't hit the bloody target anyhow," when the French Air Force commenced a raid on the Crown Prince's headquarters during the visit of Crown Princess Cecily. Goering and Lürzer responded by badly damaging a French plane with a pistol before dropping a small bomb on a French aerodrome. As a result of this raid, Goering decided to carry an improvised machine gun when flying, becoming the first German airman to bring a machine gun with him into aerial combat. Once aviation technology had improved, Goering decided he wanted to pilot his own plane rather than being relegated to being just an observer. Goering and Lürzer both attended senior meetings despite their low rank, but their experience in the air proved too valuable for them to be left out. At this time, he caught the attention of Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm and returned to Freiburg to gain his wings. He never crashed a plane during his training, and in October 1915 he gained the title of Jagdflieger, also known as a pursuit fighter. Following the award of his new title, Goering and Lürzer joined the Jagdstaffel 5, the newest fighter group, which was formed to fight on the Western Front. Goering saw aerial combat in November when he engaged the new British aircraft, a Handley Page, which was a large aircraft for the time, supporting a crew of 2, the pilot along with one other person, who would observe, repair, and shoot at enemy aircraft, although Goering's aviatic was more nimble than the Handley Page, which allowed him to outmaneuver and take its gunner out of action. Goering was attacked by a squad of Sopwith fighters, and his engine and fuel tank were hit. He sustained an injury himself and began to lose consciousness until the sound of machine gun fire brought him out of his state of shock, allowing him to pull his throttle up from the nosedive his plane was in. He crash-landed in the cemetery of a church next to a field hospital, where he was pulled from the wreckage and operated on for a critical wound to his hip, which, if not operated on, would have caused him to bleed out. In total, 60 bullet holes were found in the fuselage of his aviatic. Goering's wounds left him out of action for over a year, but it was during this time that the art of air combat was rapidly developing. This new form of warfare was greatly romanticized as a deadly duel, in which the ace with the best wit would win the day. In the meantime, Lürzer was appointed as commandant to Field Squadron 26, based in Mulhouse, where Goering would join him in 1916. Goering's reputation as a fighter pilot had spread, and he received the Zering Lion with swords, the Karl Friedrich Order, along with the Hohenzollern Medal with swords, 3rd class. In May of 1917, he was put in charge of the 27th Air Squadron, which flew out of the same airfield as the 26th Squadron near Flanders. Goering and Lürzer squadrons would combine to create a new unit called the Jagdgeschwader, commanded by Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron. In 1918, Germany launched an offensive against the Triple Entente on the Western Front, but by April, Richthofen was killed in action, leading to Goering's rapid rise up the ranks. In May, Goering was preparing to take off when his adjutant stopped him, informing him he had been awarded the Pour le Mérite, the highest honor that could be given to an individual for continual bravery on the battlefield. Richthofen was soon replaced by Captain Reinhardt in May, but he was killed shortly after crashing an experimental plane Goering had recently flown himself. On the 7th of July, Goering was selected to command the Jagdgeschwader, and in a ceremony he was given the Richthofen emblem, a walking stick which had been passed down by the previous commanders. Goering would keep this walking stick with him till the day he died. As the end of the war approached, the orders the soldiers received became increasingly confusing and hypocritical. For example, on the 10th of November, he received instructions telling him to surrender their planes to the American forces, whilst another order told him to evacuate all of their equipment to Darmstadt. And then, on the 11th of November, the official news of the armistice reached the troops, along with the order to halt the evacuations. But Goering refused. He instead told his fighters to fly to Darmstadt, although some would surrender to the French at Strasbourg as intended. Others mistook Goering's instructions and flew to Mannheim, where soldiers and workers' councils had revolted and confiscated the pilots' firearms. Word reached Goering, and without hesitation, he and the rest of his squadron flew to Mannheim. Goering threatened he would shoot the aerodrome if the weapons were not released, and the revolutionaries obliged. The squadron flew to Darmstadt, where Goering ordered them to crash land their planes so they would not fall into the hands of the enemy. Goering would be honorably discharged from the German Air Force with the rank of captain in the Bavarian town of Aschaffenburg, and it was here that he discovered that he was a gifted orator, and his men would often cheer him on as he raged against the German people for their betrayal of the army, who had sacrificed so much to protect them. Goering lived a nomadic life after his resignation from the army and would spend some time in Denmark. In 1920, Goering was asked by Count Erich von Rosen, a renowned explorer, to fly him to his estate on Lake Bavon. However, the weather was horrendous, and by the time they landed on the frozen lake, it was too late for Goering to return. Count Rosen offered Goering to stay the night in the castle, where he would meet Count Rosen's wife's sister, Baroness Karin von Kantzow. Goering quickly fell in love with the woman during the night, as the group sang songs. Karin was 5 years older than Goering, and was married with an 8-year-old son, but she was estranged from her Swedish husband and was looking for the love and affection Goering was offering. By the end of Goering's stay, they had arranged to meet Karin's parents at their home in Sweden. Karin's father was Baron Karl Frock, an officer in the Swedish army, while her mother was Baroness Huldini Beamish-Fock, who was an Englishwoman whose family had lived in Ireland. Karin's sister Fanny was married to Count Richard von Wilhelmowitz-Müllendorf, who was an officer in the German army but had been killed in the Great War. The loss of her brother-in-law made her sympathetic towards Germany and also towards Goering, yet the prospect of divorce as well as Goering's unemployed status made the match unlikely, and so Goering returned to Berlin in 1921 to enroll in a university to study political science at the age of 28. Meanwhile, Karin convinced her husband to divorce her, and he even gave her a sum of money which would allow her to marry Goering. The couple married in Munich on the 3rd of February 1922 and moved to Hockreuth in the Bavarian Alps, roughly 50 miles from Munich. The couple were avid nationalists, and it did not take long for them to become involved in politics. Goering met Hitler in 1922 and soon became active in the party. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or Nazi Party, was based in Munich, as the Bavarian government was ineffective at handling radical political parties. The core of the party lay in the Sturmabteilung, which was composed of working-class and ex-military men, who guarded party meetings, whilst also instigating fights with other political parties. In fact, the NSDAP were a welcomed political party, as they frequently attacked the Communist Party, who were not welcomed at all since being ousted from power. As a result of Goering's interest in the party and his prior military experience, Hitler offered Goering a position in the NSDAP as the leader of the Sturmabteilung. Goering set out two goals as leader. He said, quote, "At first it was important to weld the SA into a stable organization, to discipline it and to make of it a completely reliable unit which had to carry out the orders which I or Adolf Hitler should give it. I strive from the beginning to bring into the SA those members of the party who were young and idealistic enough to devote their free time and their entire energies to it. In the second place, I tried to find recruits among laborers. Goering's exploits from the Great War made him an ideal candidate to run the SA, as he was held in high regard by counter-revolutionaries as well as nationalists wishing to smash the Communist Party. Later in life, Hitler would praise Goering, whilst also dismissing the later work of Ernst Röhm when he said, quote, "He is the only one of its heads that ran the SA properly. I gave him a disheveled rabble. In a short time, he had organized a division of 11,000 men." The two formed an unlikely duo, as Goering was a highly decorated officer receiving orders from Hitler, who was low-born and never achieved a rank higher than a Meldegänger, or officer's runner. It was at this time that the Goerings moved to a new home in the suburb of Obermenzing in the city of Munich. It was modestly furnished, and their home became the meeting place for the NSDAP. During one of these meetings, Goering would meet Rudolf Hess, a Great War pilot, Alfred Rosenberg, a self-proclaimed philosopher, and Captain Ernst Röhm, an active military member with connections to weapons depots. These men were needed to formulate the rise of the NSDAP, and were exactly who Goering was comfortable being around. Both Goering and Röhm's relationship with Hitler was similar, as Hitler found a way to leverage the best traits out of his leaders whilst also keeping the unruly aspects in line. Furthermore, Röhm's active status in the Bavarian military allowed for easy recruitment into the SA, and whilst Röhm viewed Goering more as a rival than as an ally, his own memoirs never outright declared his disdain for the man. After all, Goering was useful, as he was more even-tempered and unwilling to make rash decisions, unlike Röhm, who was given the title of Chief of Staff of the SA. However, it was Goering who was truly in charge. Röhm would not be given command of the SA until 1930, yet throughout 1923, Goering strenuously organized and drilled the SA in the woods outside of Munich and maintained a hesitant relationship with the state government. Violence erupted between the Communists and the Nazis on the 1st of May 1923, a rallying day for Communist members, and as a result of the 1st of May incident, Goering and the others were forced to rethink their strategy to grow the NSDAP. It would not be long before Hitler and Goering were both begging General von Lossow to join them, as Gustav Stresemann had become Chancellor and had enacted martial law, noticing the increased political unrest. In part, this declaration was made because of the Black Reichswehr, under the direction of Major Buchröcker, who now threatened the government. The Black Reichswehr was a secret organization within the Reichswehr, which was associated with the secret society known as Feme, an organization marked by extreme violence, even worse than the street violence perpetrated by the Nazis and the Communists. Stresemann's objection towards passive resistance to the French occupation of the Ruhr deeply infuriated many Germans, especially the Nazi Party. Goering attempted one last time to convince General von Lossow to break his agreement to stay in line with Berlin in order to join them in the coup to unseat Stresemann and his government. This would not come to fruition, leaving Hitler and Goering without an ally. However, a prime opportunity would come along, which prompted the need to act. Gustav von Kahr, the new state commissioner for Bavaria, Colonel Hans Ritten von Seisser, the Premier of Bavaria, and General von Lossow had announced a meeting on the 8th of November 1923 at the Bürger Bräukeller Beer Hall, where they were going to give a speech to 3,000 people. It was believed by Hitler that Kahr's intention behind announcing the meeting was to declare Bavarian independence. If this was true, an egotistical Hitler could not let him steal the glory of revolution. Goering was stressed during the ordeal, as his mother had just passed. Karin had pneumonia, and all the while he was trying to gather the stormtroopers for the revolution. Hitler stormed the beer hall and jumped on the table and fired a shot in the air, shouting, "The national revolution has begun." Hitler motioned with his gun to the ministers to leave the room, and Goering was able to read the reaction of the crowd. He took the podium and shouted, "There is nothing to fear. We are your friends. You've no reason to grumble. You've got your beer." Meanwhile, Hitler and the ministers unwillingly formed the new government, believing General Ludendorff was going to be involved, despite even him not knowing of his involvement. Ludendorff soon arrived and was irate at not being consulted over the plan. Yet there was a problem, as Hitler had to leave in order to settle a street fight between the SA and Bavarian soldiers, leaving Ludendorff in charge of the ministers. The ministers left and abandoned the plot. Kahr quietly moved the state's government to Regensburg, printed pamphlets denouncing their allegiance to the Nazi Party, and ensured the military was not aligned to the Nazis. Meanwhile, Goering finally found time to telephone Karin to tell her not to worry, that he may not come home that night. Even during the coup, his main thought was with Karin. The situation continued to deteriorate as Hitler and Goering did not act as quickly as Röhm had, who had taken over the military headquarters in Munich. As the morning came, Ludendorff proposed the group march to the center of Munich, believing the army and police would not fire on them because of his reputation. By 11 in the morning, Ludendorff led the column of Nazis towards the center of Munich. The column of 3,000 had to cross the Ludwig Bridge in order to reach the inner city of Munich, but armed policemen were blocking their path. Goering approached alone, informing the officers that they held hostages, and if they were to use force against the Nazis, the hostages and those who resisted would be shot. The police stood down and allowed the column to advance, but they had their weapons confiscated as a precaution. The group continued through Zweibrückenstrasse, heading towards the War Ministry where Röhm was being besieged, but in order to get there, they had to pass through the small street of Residenzstrasse, which was blocked by armed police. The Nazis shouted at the police to surrender, but shots were fired and the Nazis scattered. Goering was shot in the groin and was bleeding heavily from his injury. He was taken by stormtroopers into the house of a furniture dealer named Balin and his wife Ilse, who ironically were Jewish, and Ilse dressed the wound as best she could. Once night had fallen, Goering was sent to Professor von Ach to treat his injuries, and Karin arrived to learn that General von Lossow had issued a warrant for Goering's arrest, and Goering begged her to help him escape from Bavaria. Goering's condition was serious, and so he could not easily be moved. But Karin did receive help from friends in the town of Garmisch to smuggle him there. Goering's recovery was slow as his wounds became reinfected, leaving him bitter about the situation, and before long Goering's presence in Garmisch became well known, and he was arrested and placed under guard at a hospital. The crowd sympathized with Goering, and mass demonstrations occurred outside in support, and with Karin's persistence and support from the police, Goering was smuggled out of Germany and into Austria, where he would be operated on in a hospital in Innsbruck. Following the surgery, Goering would suffer from high fevers and excruciating pain, which he would be given morphine for twice a day. As a result of this, Goering would fight morphine addiction for the rest of his life. Goering spent a considerable amount of time in exile, prohibited from returning to Germany by Hitler, who refused to let him stand trial for the failed putsch. His first assignment would be in February of 1924, when he was to speak at a nationalist convention in Innsbruck. Goering soon took a leadership role for the Nazi Party in Vienna and worked closely with Austrian Nazi Walter Riehl. He stayed at the Tirolerhof with Karin and was barely able to pay for their stay, with most of their possessions impounded by the Bavarian authorities. At the end of the trial in April, Ludendorff was acquitted, while Hitler was found guilty along with the other Nazi leadership including Goering, who was found guilty in absentia. Goering filed for amnesty, but never received it. The results of the trial should have ended the Nazi Party, but instead it resulted in a resurgence, seeing the Nazis earn a seat in the Reichstag. The Goerings left Austria and travelled through Italy before stopping in Rome. They would be given an audience with Benito Mussolini, where they talked at length about the failed beer hall putsch. Following their short stay in Italy, the couple moved into a flat in Odengarten, Sweden, to take care of Karin's mother. But Karin's own health soon started to decline, as she started having epileptic seizures, and as she suffered more from epileptic episodes, Goering's health also deteriorated with his morphine addiction. In 1927, Paul von Hindenburg was elected president and issued a general political amnesty which included Goering, who eagerly returned to his homeland. Goering worked hard to regain his wealth and connect with Hitler for employment and political purposes. Goering's former position as the leader of the SA was currently occupied by Frank von Pfeffer, a wealthy aristocrat who Hitler could not afford to dismiss due to his economic advantages. The Nazi Party was fiscally weak and needed strong economic backers to succeed, and Goering's vulnerable financial status did not help them. Despite this, Goering was accepted back into the Nazi Party and sent to Berlin to work on accumulating wealth. It was at this time that Goering's connection to the airline industry paid off, as his friend, Erhard Milch, senior executive of Lufthansa, got him a job working as a business representative with the Bavarian Motor Works Company. By the winter, Goering had successfully petitioned Hitler that he should be one of the representatives for the Nazi Party in the upcoming Reichstag election. He proved to Hitler he could stand a chance, as he stood against Otto and Gregor Strasser, the brothers who had earlier broken away from the Nazi movement due to their leftist ideology, being driven out eventually by Hitler's cult personality. In fact, Goering's position as a representative suited the Nazi Party, as Goering was able to banter with the elite of society, while Hitler was terrible at small talk and felt uncomfortable in the company of intellectuals. In the election, the Nazis performed poorly, but Goebbels and Goering both took seats in the Reichstag. Hitler and Goebbels were less than pleased, but Goering was ecstatic, as it renewed his family's depleted wealth and allowed him to move into a modern flat with 5 rooms at 7 Badensche Strasse. As a Reichstag deputy, he sat on the Communications Committee, which also oversaw the aviation section. He lobbied to increase funding for the airline industry, which was exclusively held by his friends at Lufthansa, because it was a, quote, great patriotic task, which needed fulfillment. In part, this was also a ploy to build up Germany's military air defense. The push by Goering to finance these industrial giants also worked as a way to bribe the industrialist to side with the Nazi Party. Following the victory in the Reichstag, the Goering family lost Karin's mother on the 25th of September 1931. Karin was barely well enough to attend the funeral in Stockholm, and Goering returned to Berlin to oversee political matters. But on the 17th of October, Karin, who had been ill with tuberculosis, died of heart failure. Goering was devastated at the loss, and he returned to Berlin after the funeral, as he believed it was the only way he could get over her death. After months of political upheaval and multiple chancellors resigning from office, Hitler ascended to the chancellorship on the 30th of January 1933. Goering held 3 positions in Hitler's cabinet: Minister without portfolio, Minister of the Interior for Prussia, and Reich Commissioner for Aviation. As a minister without portfolio, he acted as an ambassador, speaking on behalf of Nazi Germany. While the Minister of the Interior for Prussia was technically under former Chancellor von Pappen's supervision, it did give him authority over the police in the largest and most important German state. Meanwhile, as the Reich Commissioner for Aviation, he had the honor to develop the Air Force of the Reich. He also maintained his role as president of the Reichstag until the Nazis dissolved it on the 5th of March 1933. It would also be in early March that the concentration camps were founded, although Goering's opinion of them differed to the other Nazi leaders, as he felt their role should be one of re-education for those who suffered from political delinquency. Much of the early history of the camps centers around the intense rivalry between Goering, Himmler and Röhm. As a result of this rivalry, Goering created a secret police force, which would patrol Prussia. They would eventually become known as the Geheime Staatspolizei, or Gestapo. Himmler soon became the police chief of Bavaria, and in an effort to keep power away from Himmler, Goering moved the Gestapo on the 26th of April from the Prussian administration to their own headquarters. Hitler wished to unify the police forces and gave the Gestapo to Himmler on the 20th of April 1934. The rivalry with Röhm was also growing at this time, as he was attempting to replace the Reichswehr with the SA, a move which threatened both Hitler and Goering. As an act of defiance, Röhm helped establish nearly 50 concentration camps by the end of 1933, despite Goering's so-called approved concentration camps. The SS, out of their own defiance, founded Dachau concentration camp in the spring of 1933 and fired upon Goering's men when they tried to investigate the unauthorized concentration camp. Hitler forced Himmler to close the camp, yet Goering was outclassed as he lost control of the police to Himmler. Röhm was becoming more bold with his demands, and as a result, Goering allied with Himmler to try to eliminate him. They needed time before they could move on Röhm, but Goering's health was starting to fail. Goering had grown fat as a result of inconsistent eating schedules and overindulgence when entertaining guests. His preferred foods included sandwiches and beer, along with his favorite, which was cake. Goering's sleeping habits weren't much better, as he would stay up late watching films privately, going to bed at 2 or 3 a.m. and requesting to be woken up at 6:30, although Goering hardly needed to be wakened since he suffered from insomnia. In May of 1933, Hitler appointed Goering Reichsmaster of the Hunt and Master of the German Forest. Goering loved the countryside and quickly invoked laws to protect wildlife such as elk, bison, boars, swans, and birds of prey. He restricted the number of hunters allowed and outlawed poaching, hunting on horseback, or the use of traps. It was also due to this love of the forest that he purchased prime real estate in the Schorfheide, a vast area near the Baltic Sea and Polish border. He would build Karin Hall in Schorfheide, near the lake called Wackersee, and it would be here that he would create a sanctuary for both wildlife and himself. It would be a great achievement for Goering, as he designed every aspect of the house, quote, down to the door handles. Just before Himmler took control of the Gestapo away from Goering, Robert Diels came to him with a new tool he had acquired abroad, which could be used to listen in on telephone calls. Goering turned it over to his agents and instructed his research staff officers to start monitoring nearly all high-ranking Nazi officials on Goering's list. Goering received a wave of information, including jokes about him, but he seemed to enjoy them and laugh about it. His most important wiretapping came in a conversation between General Werner von Blomberg, Minister of Defense and head of the Reichswehr, Gruppenführer Karl Ernst, as well as Ernst Röhm. There were frequent conversations held by von Blomberg over concerns surrounding Röhm usurping control of the army, and his fears were backed by Röhm and Ernst's own exchanges. It also confirmed Goering's suspicions of Röhm's hatred for him, as Röhm was heard calling him the Pig Goering and Herr Reaktion, or Mr. Reaction. Goering and Himmler's opportunity would come when Röhm proposed a joint conference between the SA, SS and Reichswehr. This led to growing resentment of Röhm, and if Hitler would not stop him, then the army would not support him. The SA was called to Bad Weissee for a leadership conference, and it was here that the trap would be sprung. Hitler and other top Nazi officials raided the Hanselbauer Hotel on the 30th of June 1934 and arrested Röhm and other SA leaders. Goering was in Berlin, raiding the SA headquarters, where he meticulously went room to room, pointing at individuals, ordering their arrest. The Night of the Long Knives, as it would be known, was an act of political suppression against inner party members, carried out to settle political disagreements. The following year, on the 10th of April 1935, Göring would ask Emmy Sonnemann, an actress he had been dating since 1932, to marry him. It was to be a grand event, with great pomp and circumstance. The streets decorated for the event. Soldiers lined the streets leading to the cathedral, and all traffic was stopped for the procession. Hitler would serve as the best man for Göring at the wedding. However, there was a possibility that the wedding occurred at Hitler's behest, as he believed there were too many eligible men among the high-ranking Nazi members. Following the wedding, Emmy would be crowned as First Lady of the Third Reich by Hitler, and the couple retreated to Karin Hall with a small entourage. Göring slipped away and spent an hour at Karin's tomb in the mausoleum. The next morning, Göring and Emmy left for Wiesbaden, and then went on to Yugoslavia for their honeymoon. Göring was promoted to Reichsmarschall on the 4th of February 1938 following Hitler's dismissal of 6 generals for anti-Nazi views, and his promotion of himself as Commander-in-Chief of German Armed Forces. In March, Austria was invaded and incorporated into the Nazi Reich under the eyes of Göring. Following their annexation, the Austrian Nazi Party wanted Göring to increase propaganda against the Jewish population. Göring was reluctant, as he enjoyed Jewish composers and painters, yet believed they were guilty of profiteering and scheming, leading to the defeat of Germany in World War I. In private conversations with Emmy, he would say, quote, "The Jews were just like any other people, but a bit smarter," which he would often say with a grin. He would also say that they had good and bad people. He felt squeamish when Goebbels and Himmler talked about the extermination of the Jews, and would often excuse himself. The Görings had their first and only child, Edda, on the 2nd of June 1938, and Hitler would act as the newborn's godfather. In the following year, on the 1st of September 1939, German troops invaded Poland, and Göring would ascend to the pinnacle of his power. Hitler had selected Göring to be his heir should anything ever happen to him. As the war progressed, Göring started to argue with Hitler over strategic decisions. Göring wanted to start the air assault on Britain, while Hitler wanted to hold them for the attack on France. Hitler instead set his eyes on the Nordic countries, although Göring had personally guaranteed Sweden's neutrality, despite Hitler's own wishes to invade Sweden for their iron ore. Göring was able to broker a treaty in which Sweden would remain independent and, in return, give the Nazis the iron ore they needed. Following the defeat of the British at Dunkirk, Göring requested an immediate attack on the British. He believed the disorientated state of the British military would allow for even the most ill-conceived plan to succeed. Hitler refused, believing Britain would surrender in the next few weeks, unlike Göring, who knew they would only surrender once the final blow had been dealt. The good weather turned terrible, which prohibited them from flying because Göring wanted the most accurate bombing raids to destroy ports, factories and airfields. When the Luftwaffe was finally unleashed, they met heavy resistance from the RAF. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 1,500 planes as they underestimated the advancement in British radar and code decryption. This would be the beginning of a year-long campaign of bombing England, which became known as the Blitz. On the 9th of August 1940, Göring and Hitler had an argument over their next military moves. Hitler wished to attack the Soviet Union as a preventative measure. Göring pulled Hitler up on his hypocrisy. As Hitler had stated in his biography Mein Kampf, he would never involve the German people in a two-front war, similar to the Great War. Hitler was outraged over Göring's dismissal of his plan, and even more so that Göring ignored him to continue arguing his point. Hitler had become obsessed with attacking the Soviet Union, and Göring pleaded with Hitler to look at Napoleon's failure to conquer Russia. As comparable to the British, he argued that the Russians would not broker peace. In 1941, Göring became involved with his most infamous interest, his love of art. Göring had long planned the Hermann Göring Museum, an art gallery which he planned to open in 1953. He loved Renaissance and Dutch paintings, as he was well versed in the two. He had 4 stately homes that needed to be filled, and he enjoyed staring at paintings for hours. Göring had multiple staff members who helped him acquire the art. He even told them not to worry about the race of the individuals selling the art, and instead focus only on the art. When further anti-Jewish laws were enacted, Goering used his power to assist Jewish art dealers into Switzerland to avoid prosecution. Goering also worked closely with directors of national institutes such as the Louvre to build special bunkers to protect the art from bombing raids. Whilst Goering did protect collections, he plundered others, having trains full of art shipped back to Germany to be displayed in public museums or private collections. It was an impressive collection with superb record-keeping by Andreas Hosfer and his assistant Gisela Limberger. The two created a detailed ledger which included photographs of every piece of art when it was bought and sold, along with the specific detail of what had been restored. All money made from the sale of art would be directed towards the construction of the Hermann Göring Museum. On the 31st of July 1941, Göring ordered Himmler's right-hand man Reinhard Heydrich to make, quote, necessary preparations for a total solution of the Jewish question. It was this command that would, the following year, in January 1942, culminate in Heydrich calling the infamous Wannsee Conference, in which he laid out the details by which millions of Jews across Europe would be exterminated in purpose-built death camps. Although Göring had little involvement in the day-to-day operations of the final solution, he did give the order for the SS to begin operations to liquidate the Jews, and it was this order, more than anything else, that would result in both Göring's death sentence at the Nuremberg trials and cement his reputation as being amongst the primary instigators of the Holocaust. By the end of 1941 and into 1942, it was becoming clear that the Russian campaign would not be over quickly. The troops, supplies, logistics, and technology needed to defeat Russia was outpacing the Nazis' ability to produce them. Göring was still in charge of labor, currency, and rationing, but this changed on the 21st of March 1942, when he announced Fritz Sauckel would take over the duties of assigning the use of labor. While Göring was still to be consulted on the matters, he effectively removed his hands from the cruelty and extermination of the Jewish people, which was to begin in Eastern Europe. Sauckel filled the factories with slave labor and ordered they be worked to death. Hitler and Göring's relationship became more strained as the war went on. The Allies increasingly became unopposed as the number of planes protecting German cities diminished. Hitler ordered an all-out assault on England by the Luftwaffe, a feat which was both impossible and suicidal, and Göring was distraught over it. Hitler would neither accept Göring's advice or take his resignation. Göring was stuck. As the Third Reich was disintegrating, Göring withdrew himself from the decision-making process, and he wasn't present during the D-Day invasion. His last ounce of gravitas was used to release his nephew, who had been arrested following the failed Operation Valkyrie. He was suspected of being part of the coup, but there was no evidence to prove it. As the Red Army advanced in 1945, they were closing in on Karin Hall. Göring had the art removed, and a demolition team rigged the house to explode. As Germany collapsed, Göring and Emmy escaped into Bavaria, where US First Lieutenant Jerome N. Shapiro found him stuck in a traffic jam and brought him into American custody. He remarked how the Görings were happy to be found by the Americans, as if they were escaping a bad dream. Göring was taken to the 7th Army Interrogation Center in Augsburg, and it was here where he talked freely to the Americans. In the reports, they noted, quote, "Göring is by no means the comical figure he has been depicted so many times in the newspaper reports. He is neither stupid nor a fool, but generally cool and calculating. He is certainly not a man to be underrated. Although he tried to soft-pedal many of the most outrageous crimes committed by Germany, he said enough to show that he is as much responsible for the policies within Germany. Göring is at all times an actor who does not disappoint his audience." Göring painted a vivid, startling, and proven authentic account of life in Nazi Germany, which had eluded the Allies for so long. He told the Allies he was unable to save all of the art, and some had fallen into the Russians' hands. Göring helped the Allies recover all the art they could, except for the ones that had fallen into the hands of the Russians in Berlin. Göring was moved to a small suite in the Palace Hotel at Mondorf in Luxembourg. This would serve as the jail for many high-ranking Nazis, such as Joachim von Ribbentrop, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Albert Speer, and Hjalmar Schacht. And it could be said that there was some irony here, as Dr. Robert M. Kempner was to prosecute the Nuremberg trials, and he was once the youngest prosecuting counsel in the Prussian police department when Goering fired him in 1933. Leading up to the trial, Goering was detoxed from the morphine and lost significant weight. There were unannounced room inspections to ensure there was no contraband, and before the trial, Dr. Kempner indicted Goering with all 4 counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to plan and commit all 3. In response to the upcoming trial, he said, quote, "It's just a cut and dried political affair, and I'm prepared for the consequences. I have no doubt that the press will play a bigger part in the decision than the judges, and I'm sure that the Russian and French judges, at least, already have their instructions. I can answer for anything I have done, and I can't answer for anything I haven't done. But the victors are the judges." The trial at Nuremberg would see the remaining Nazi leadership turn on one another, mainly Albert Speer and Goering. Goering tried to keep the other Nazis in line, but Speer won out in the end. Colonel Andrus successfully found a way to lessen Goering's influence by separating the lunch groups into specific categories to minimize Goering's authority. And it worked. The judges found Goering guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced him to death. Goering was to be hung, but he requested to be executed by firing squad as it was a soldier's death. His request was denied, and the security of the prison was tightened to prevent the war criminals from cheating the hangman's noose. In the final days of the war, all Nazi leaders carried poison with them in case they were captured, yet medicines were heavily monitored by the guards, preventing the possibility of poison pills being slipped to the defendants. The executions were set for 2 a.m. on the 16th of October 1946, and the next series of events is where the mystery begins. The prison chaplain, Captain Henry Gereke, saw Goering in his cell in the evening before his execution and noted his depressed state. When Captain Gereke left, Lieutenant John West came for his nightly inspection and found no contraband. West stated Goering was very happy and talked at length to him during the search. At 9:30 p.m., Dr. Floyker and Lieutenant Arthur McLinden visited to give Goering his nightly pill and left 3 minutes later when Private First Class Gordon Bingham came for guard duty. At 10:30, Private First Class Harold Johnson took over for Bingham. Johnson noticed Goering's body was stiff and not moving around 10:44 p.m. and by the time the senior guard officers reached Goering's cell, he was dead from cyanide poisoning. Goering wrote 2 farewell letters. The first rebuts the claims of the trial, while the second was an affectionate letter to Emmy. He claimed to have always had a vial of cyanide, and he even wrote a letter to Colonel Andrus bragging about having one. In his place, Ribbentrop would be the first to be executed, with the executions only lasting an hour and 15 minutes. Their bodies would be placed into caskets and taken to a crematorium. The building had been heavily guarded in case of civil disturbance, and once the bodies were verified and cremated, they were driven to the countryside and dumped into a gutter. Hermann Goering remains one of the more complex and fascinating members of Hitler's inner circle. His record as a fighter ace in the First World War, along with his drug addiction, love of the arts, and the finer things in life, undoubtedly made him a compelling figure at first glance. However, he was also greedy, selfish, and ruthless, as time and again he schemed against his enemies in the Nazi regime, used his power to make himself rich, and at all times placed his own interests above those of the Nazi Party and even his country. Furthermore, his place as being one of the instigators of the final solution has ensured that no matter how charismatic or brave he may have been early on in his life, he was, in the end, corrupted by power, becoming just another mass murderer addicted to excess. What do you think of Hermann Goering? Do you think he could have mustered the strength to stand up to Hitler, or was he doomed to cowardice? Please let us know in the comments section below. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Ammon Goeth was born as Ammon Leopold Goeth on the 11th of December 1908 in Vienna, which at the time was the capital of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father was Amon Franz Goethe, the owner of the Viennese publishing house Verlaganstalt Amon Franz Goethe. The company specialized in military books, but also sold religious publications and postcards. It did quite well, and as a result, the younger Amon was born into an upper-middle-class family of the Vienna business community. Amon's mother was Bertha Schwendt Goethe. He was the couple's only child, and as such, he could look forward to a comfortable life given his family's prosperity. Young Amon was afforded a good education for the time. He was sent to an upper-middle-class Catholic school in Vienna, and would eventually attend the Weidhoven an der Theier College, close to what today is the Czech border. This was an agricultural college, which Goethe began attending when he was still in his mid-teens. But despite the affluence of the Goethe family, Amon's childhood was troubled in its own way. Amon Franz Goethe often traveled for his work, sometimes very widely, in an effort to open up new markets for the publishing house's books and other printed material. Back in Vienna, the day-to-day labor of actually managing the office and its employees consequently fell to Bertha Goethe, and so, with both his father and mother largely indisposed, Amon was largely raised by his aunt. This, combined with being an only child, left him somewhat isolated, but also resentful of his parents. Thus, the beginnings of the bitter, savage man that would later emerge were already making themselves felt when Amon was just a teenager. Years later, he would reflect on this to his mistress in Poland, Ruth Irena Calder, who noted in an interview in 1975 that Amon felt as though his parents had neglected him. We are fortunate to know extensive details about Goethe's earlier life, not because he kept a diary or composed a memoir, such as is the case with some other senior Nazis such as Joseph Goebbels and Albert Speer, but because there is an extensive file on Goethe in the Bundesarchiv Berlin Documentation Center. This was compiled by the Schutzstaffel or SS, the Nazi Party paramilitary organization which Goethe would subsequently join, and includes statements by Goethe himself about his youth and early adult years. Supplementing this are the extensive details about Goethe's wartime record and war crimes, which was produced as part of his trial after the conflict, and which gives further extensive details on his actions in the 1930s and 1940s. This contains first-hand accounts by some of those who witnessed Goethe's actions during the Second World War. And all of this is supplemented by accounts by individuals who would eventually escape from the concentration camp in Poland which Goethe ended up commanding. Furthermore, the interview which his former mistress, Ruth Irena Calder, gave in 1975 to the Israeli historian Tom Segev is a very useful personal account of Goethe's views, although probably biased in many respects. As a consequence, we are able to develop a more detailed picture of Goethe's life and actions during the war than we otherwise would be able to for a good many of the other commandants of the concentration camps. Goethe's childhood years were spent in a country which was mired in war. For years, the major European powers had been aligning themselves into two armed camps, driven by a wide range of forces, including colonial rivalry, regional conflicts in areas such as the Balkans, and rivalry particularly between Britain and Germany. The Empire of Austria-Hungary, in which Goethe was born and grew up, was mainly concerned in this maelstrom with the Balkans, where it was vying with Tsarist Russia for influence as the Ottoman Empire collapsed. However, the government in Vienna was also concerned about the increasing nationalist movements amongst peoples such as the Croats and Serbs. In the summer of 1914, a Serb nationalist assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and the crisis which ensued in the weeks that followed eventually spiraled into a European-wide war between Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side and Britain, France and Russia on the other. Eventually others would involve themselves until it became a global conflict. The First World War would last until 1918, with Britain and France finally emerging as the main victors. At its conclusion, the German Empire collapsed, and a new republic named after the town of Weimar was created, while the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismembered with major regions such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia acquiring their independence from a new, smaller state of Austria. Goethe began to rebel against his social and familial background in his late teens. He would later claim that he did so in order to turn his back on the bourgeois social values which his parents had tried to instill in him. They wished for Ammon to be educated in a way that would prepare him for taking over the publishing business one day. But although Ammon was clearly an intelligent student, he showed little commitment to his work and eventually dropped out of the agricultural college he attended at Weidhoven after just a few months. Rather, Goethe was more interested in athletics and physical activity, and, more concerning, was an interest he had developed in politics during his few months in college. In 1925, when he was still just 17 years of age, he joined the youth chapter of the Austrian branch of the National Socialist Workers' Party, a pan-Germanic party which had been established in Germany in the aftermath of the First World War. The Nazi Party, as it was commonly known, was committed to the idea of reversing the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had ended the war, creating a strong Greater Germany, and fighting against the perceived influences of the Jewish people and communists in Germany and surrounding nations. Headed by a fellow Austrian called Adolf Hitler, they had attempted a military insurgency in Munich in November 1923, and were thereafter regarded as an extremist party in both Germany and Austria. Goethe had been drawn to the Nazi Party for a number of reasons. Many Austrians were interested in Nazism owing to its insistence that the peace terms offered to Germany and Austria in the aftermath of the First World War were overly punitive, and most historians today agree that the treaty terms were indeed overly harsh and created severe economic problems in these countries. But Goethe, with his interest in sport and athletics, was also attracted by the party's emphasis on the physicality of the German people and their martial and sporting prowess. Its associations, such as the youth branch of the party, also fostered camaraderie, and for an individual who had been raised as an only child and had distant parents, the Nazi Party perhaps offered the promise of some companionship. But if these were some of the more benign things which attracted Goethe, there were also less positive aspects to his liking of the party. He was openly anti-Semitic and possessed of racial hatred towards the Jewish people. This was made clear in 1927 when, while having returned to Vienna to work in his parents' publishing house, he joined the Styrian Home Protection Organization, a rabidly anti-Semitic branch of the Austrian Home Guard, another fascist group operating in the country at the time. Goethe continued to work for some time with his parents in Vienna, but without undergoing the sort of academic training which would have prepared him to succeed his father as head of the firm one day. It was clear he viewed his position there at the time as a temporary employment, which he would possibly move on from. It was in Vienna in 1930 that he became caught up in a power struggle within Austrian fascism. Following the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the Great Depression which followed it, the Nazis had moved from being a fringe party with the support of little more than 5% of the German people to quickly becoming a major force in German politics. As they did, the Austrian branch of the party sought to consolidate its hold over Austrian fascism by forcing the Austrian Home Guard and other groups to merge with them. This did not succeed, and the Nazis now decreed that Austrian members could not also be members of the Home Guard. Goethe was aligned with both, but tied his flag to the Nazi Party after some deliberation. Accordingly, in May 1931, Goethe, who until this time had remained a member only of the youth wing of the Nazis, became a full member, number 510,764. This would later qualify him as an old fighter, a party member who had joined before January 1932. Once he had become a fully fledged member of the party, Goethe's involvement in its various branches and organizations became more extensive. For instance, he had become a member of the SA, the Sturmabteilung or Brown Shirts, a paramilitary wing of the party which wore brown shirts as their military uniform. Members participated in military drills and parades as part of Nazi militaristic activity, and it was possible through his initial involvement with the SA. that Goethe developed an interest in the more hardline branch of the Nazis, the Schutzstaffel or SS, meaning Protection Squad, which was, like the SA, a paramilitary grouping within the Nazi Party. It was originally established as a small bodyguard unit for Hitler. However, unlike the SA, the SS placed an overt emphasis on the racial ideology of the Nazis, particularly so after Heinrich Himmler became the new head of the organization in 1929. Himmler's appointment also saw a massive increase in the size of the SS, from just hundreds of men to thousands and eventually tens of thousands. Goethe had seemingly applied to become a member of the SS in 1930. But his application was only accepted in 1932, when he became the 43,673rd member of the organization. It would be a fateful association, as the SS would in time become the body which orchestrated the worst of the Nazis' war crimes across Europe. 1933 was a significant year for both Goethe and the Nazi movement overall. As the economic situation had deteriorated in Germany in 1931 and 1932, the Nazis had risen to become a major force in German politics. Elections to the Reichstag in 1932 confirmed them to be the leading party in the country, while still only able to command just over one-third of the vote. The Communists, regarded as their ideological opponents, were the second strongest performing party, and so Germany was now engaged in a tussle between the right-wing Nazis and the left-wing Communists. Eventually, the Nazis won out, as the center-right leaning business community in Germany decided to back Hitler early in 1933. He became Chancellor, and within weeks a dictatorship was established through an enabling act which allowed the Nazis to rule by decree. For Goethe in Austria, the implications of this centered on the response of the Austrian government. It was concerned by the rise of the Nazis and the party's call for a greater Germany. Consequently, in 1933, it began cracking down on the Nazi movement in the country and eventually prohibited the party entirely on the 19th of June 1933. Goethe, who was already being sought for engaging in terrorist activities around Vienna on behalf of the party, fled Austria and relocated to Germany later in the year. Goethe now followed the exodus of senior members of the Austrian Nazi Party, who were streaming north over the Austrian border with Germany towards Bavaria and the city of Munich, where Hitler and the main leaders of the German Nazi Party had risen to prominence a decade earlier, and he quickly established himself here within a sort of Austrian Nazi Party in exile, one which sought to continue to disseminate the Nazi message throughout Austria from southern Germany. Goethe's specific involvement was trying to use the new medium of radio to broadcast Nazi programs and messages over the airwaves which could be picked up on in Austria. And he was also working during this time as a courier for the SS, moving between Germany clandestinely over the Austrian border. It was this activity which led to him being arrested in October 1933, as the Austrian government of Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss was trying to purge Austrian society of its Nazi element, a campaign which saw some 50,000 Austrian Nazis incarcerated by April 1934. Goethe was not among them though, as he was released in the final days of 1933 owing to a lack of evidence and returned to Germany. Our understanding of Goethe's activities in the months and years that followed is aided by the interview Goethe's mistress Ruth Irene Calder gave in 1975. She noted how Ammon continued his activities with the Austrian Nazi Party in exile following his return to Germany, but his brief arrest and imprisonment late in 1933 did not deter him from making further forays over the border into Austria in 1934, as the politics of his home country was becoming increasingly turbulent. In an effort to suppress the Nazis, Chancellor Dollfuss increasingly cemented a brand of Austro-fascism distinct from that of the Nazis, and after an attempted uprising by the Nazis in February 1934, he established a new constitution which gave himself near dictatorial powers. However, he would not live long to exercise them. On the 25th of July 1934, Dollfuss was assassinated by a squad of nearly a dozen Austrian Nazis in the Chancellery building in Vienna, and it seems clear that Goethe had played a part in the planning of the assassination. Moreover, he was one of several thousand Austrian Nazis who were detained in the country in the weeks that followed. but somehow he managed to escape from custody and yet again fled over the border to safety in southern Germany. It was a near escape, one which might have otherwise led to a lengthy jail sentence or even his execution. In the aftermath of the failed Nazi coups in Austria in the spring and summer of 1934, a new government emerged there under Kurt Schuschnigg, which maintained Dollfuss's anti-Nazi stance with greater success in the mid-1930s. As a result, many of those Austrian Nazis who had been attempting to seize power in Austria by operating from Germany resigned themselves to the fact that this would not be possible for some time. Accordingly, from late 1934, Goethe began to focus on advancing within the ranks of the SS in Germany by finding a position at Dachau concentration camp, which had recently been established in Bavaria to detain political prisoners. However, he temporarily left the organization just a few months later when he fell out with his immediate commander, Alfred Bigler. This was a time during which the Austrian members of the SS declined quite considerably, following the failure to establish control over their native land. Consequently, in the mid-1930s, Goethe turned for some time to working for his family's publishing business to handle its activities in Germany. He also married shortly after settling fully in Germany to Olga Janoschek, a woman who was recommended to Goethe by his parents who knew her family. But the marriage was immediately troubled and they divorced within just a few months. Ammon's years in exile from Austria in Germany in the mid-1930s coincided with a period during which the Nazi state was becoming increasingly belligerent on the European stage. It had always been the intention of Hitler and his followers to overturn the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Accordingly, from their first seizure of power in 1933, a gradual rearmament began throughout Germany. Then, in March 1936, the Rhineland region was remilitarized. Under the terms of Versailles, this region was to remain strictly empty of German armed forces in order to prevent any future buildup of power along the French border and the border with the Low Countries. The Allied powers, though, were willing to appease Hitler in this respect, as the area had been demilitarized for nearly 20 years. Yet it was also the first sign of a strategy of appeasement by Britain and France, which was to prove catastrophic in the years that followed. Additionally, a new German air force called the Luftwaffe had been established under the command of Hermann Göring. This newfound belligerence and rearmament spoke of a willingness by Hitler and the Nazis in Germany to increasingly confront its neighbors and the main victors of the First World War, Britain and France. This would soon have consequences for Austria and for Goethe. Goethe was relatively inactive between his moving away from the SS between late 1934 and early 1937, as he largely continued working for his parents' company from within Germany. First signs that he had returned to being an active Nazi and SS member came in the summer of 1937, when he wrote a letter to the headquarters of the Austrian Refugee Society in which he requested the transfer of his Nazi Party membership number from Austria to Munich. The timing of this is significant. Throughout 1937, political pressure was again being employed by the Nazis to try to bring Austria under its control. By the summer of that year, Hitler was determined to annex Austria and was offering renewed support to a resurgent Austrian Nazi movement. In response, Kurt Schuschnigg's government in Vienna tried to crack down again on these initiatives by mass arrests of Austrian Nazis, but this had a limited effect. Accordingly, on the 9th of March 1938, he called a referendum on the issue of unification with Germany, hoping that a victory in this vote would shore up support for the government. But what the result might have been in a fair election is difficult to determine. Before it could ever be held, Hitler ordered the German Eighth Army to cross the border into Austria. Under the German occupation, the referendum was held on the 10th of April and passed by a clearly manipulated vote of 99.7%. The Anschluss, or union, had finally come about. This union of Austria with Germany was a triumphant moment for Goethe. He could now return to his native Austria, and duly did so within days of the Anschluss occurring, and he was now under pressure to marry quickly. The SS had a rule which the head of it, Heinrich Himmler, had promulgated, that all SS men between the ages of 25 and 30 were required to get married and start a family. This directive was issued with the intention that these men, the supposed best of the Aryan race, would have numerous children which would go on to flood Germany and its dominions with ideal German citizens. Goethe was already 28 years of age and needed to settle down quickly to conform with this rule. Thus it was that he quickly established a relationship with Annie Geiger, a 23-year-old Austrian woman whom he had met at a motorcycle race. They were wed on the 23rd of October 1938, but not before passing a series of stringent physical tests and interviews set by the SS, and they would have 3 children in quick succession in the years that followed. Peter was born in 1939, but died in infancy. Werner arrived soon after in 1940, and Ingeborg appeared the following year. Goethe would have little contact with them, as Annie and the children spent most of the war, which was to follow, living in Vienna, while Goethe was stationed in Poland and elsewhere. Goethe's eagerness to abide by Himmler's directive for men of the SS of his age to marry and start a family was indicative of his newfound commitment to the organization in the aftermath of the German annexation of Austria. He now moved away from working with the family business again and committed himself fully to the SS. Much of this activity focused on the extension of the Nazi regime's brutal anti-Semitic policies into the newly acquired territory. The Nuremberg laws in Germany had earlier robbed the country's Jews of their citizenship and made them into second-class individuals in business and social terms. Now these were extended into Austria, and the persecution of the country's Jewish community began. The severity of it was particularly apparent during the Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass pogroms in November 1938, when Jewish homes and businesses all across Nazi Germany and Austria were destroyed, and thousands of Jews were either killed or seriously wounded. The attacks were particularly severe in Vienna, where most of the city's synagogues were burnt, as the capital's people and fire departments looked on and watched. No doubt Goethe was involved in some capacity, and by early 1939 he was serving in the SS Standarte 89, a group of highly organized shock troops in Vienna. It appears on a largely full-time basis, although he maintained some minimal links with the family publishing business. As Goethe was establishing his family in Vienna, the new German Third Reich was becoming ever more aggressive in its approach and willingness to test the patience of Britain and France. Following the union with Austria, Hitler almost immediately began making noises about the Sudetenland, a region in Czechoslovakia with a large population of ethnic German people living in it. Hitler insisted that if the Sudetenland was ceded to Germany, it would be the last claim he would make on territory in Europe. Taking the bait, the British and French agreed to this at a conference in Munich in September 1938. But it was nowhere near the end of Hitler's territorial ambitions. By the spring of 1939, he pressed forward again, effectively annexing the rest of Czechoslovakia and bringing Hungary into the German sphere of influence. By now, the situation was clear, and the British and French insisted that any further aggressive action would result in a declaration of war. That duly followed when the German army invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Hitler's Germany. The Second World War had begun. Goethe was soon involved in combat. At the start of hostilities, he was transferred to the SS combat unit Sturmbahn 111, and on the 9th of March 1940, he was promoted by Himmler to serve as a Verwaltungsführer, or administrative leader, of a Sonderkommando, or special unit. These units would soon be centrally involved in the Nazis' war crimes. And after serving as the administrative leader in Upper Silesia for several months, Goethe was promoted again to become a technical sergeant and was stationed by now in Katowice, or Katowice in Upper Silesia in Poland. This was an area of western Poland on the Czech border, which was of major industrial significance to the Reich, being a huge producer of coal and iron. Consequently, in the early stages of the war, a strategy was being developed here to deport or otherwise remove much of the population and effectively colonize it with German settlers. Goethe was involved in this initiative during 1941. working as a financial officer and administrator within the office of the Reich Commissioner for the Consolidation of German Nationhood. His ardent commitment to this work was recognized when he was given a certificate of service by his commanding officer, praising his service and his commitment to Nazi ideology. Despite the recognition of his usefulness in Katowice, or perhaps because of it, Goethe would soon be employed in a somewhat different fashion. With the outbreak of war, the Nazi state's attitude towards the Jewish community had become more brutal. In the 1930s, the Nazis had begun persecuting its Jewish population through a series of anti-Semitic laws which stripped the Jewish people of their citizenship and through attacks on Jewish businesses. But much worse was to follow upon the outbreak of the war. There was now an unfolding policy of forced exile. The Jews of Central Europe, and in particular the huge Jewish population within Poland, would be brutalized until they agreed to leave the Nazi Reich altogether, while pogroms and killings of Jewish people increased. And things grew more radical still, as the war effort expanded. In the spring of 1940, the Germans conquered Denmark and Norway, followed very soon after by France and the Low Countries. With its dominance of continental Europe largely achieved, the Nazis began considering the possibility of mass forced deportations or even massacres of the Jewish people, tens of thousands of whom were now being rounded up and forced into Jewish ghettos and a network of concentration camps which were being constructed across Central and Eastern Europe. Goethe would have been entirely familiar with the camp system from his time in Western Poland, but it took on an even more sinister hue in late 1941 and early 1942, when the Nazi regime determined that it would begin mass murdering Europe's Jews in the concentration camps, generally by gassing hundreds or thousands of people every day and immediately burning their corpses. The final solution, as it was termed, was adopted as Reich policy by Hitler and the other leaders in the summer of 1941, and news of its employment was relayed to a conference of senior Nazi administrators at Wannsee outside Berlin in January 1942. And Goethe was quickly involved in this sinister activity. In the summer of that year, he was reassigned to Lublin in eastern Poland, where he worked under Odilo Globocnik, himself an Austrian Nazi. Globocnik was charged with a senior role in constructing and expanding 3 concentration camps at Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, and rounding up and sending hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews to these camps, which would become some of the most horrific centers of the Holocaust, which was just commencing. In the months that followed, Goethe observed Globocnik's methods, which included a mix of severe brutality towards the Polish Jews being sent to these camps, and also a striking level of corruption. Globocnik used the inmates of the camps as mass slave labor, and he was siphoning off much of the profits from the work they performed to benefit himself. Goethe would follow these same practices himself before long. On the 11th of February 1943, Goethe was promoted again. It was a major elevation. He was to become commandant or governor, effectively, of a new concentration camp which was to be constructed at Kraków-Płaszów on the site of an already existing smaller labor camp. His reputation preceded him. Already before he arrived, the Jewish people of Kraków knew Goethe as the bloody dog of Lublin. His behavior at his new station would more than justify that designation. Goethe's first task upon arrival was to see to the camp's construction on a 200-acre site which, to add insult to injury, was being built over 2 Jewish cemeteries. To facilitate this, on the 13th of March 1943, the Jewish ghetto in Kraków was liquidated, and the remaining Jewish prisoners from within it were moved to the new camp as slave laborers, though a significant proportion of the ghetto residents was simply killed on the spot or was sent to one of the death camps. The facility was quickly constructed at Kraków-Płaszów using the newcomers, and within weeks it was a fully operational concentration camp. Upon its completion, Goethe delivered a speech to the camp's inhabitants in which he ominously stated, "I am your God." The concentration camp of Kraków-Płaszów was not one of the foremost centers of the Holocaust, which eventually led to the mass murder of approximately 6 million Jews across Europe between 1941 and 1945. as well as the murder of hundreds of thousands of Roma people, Soviet prisoners of war, and other groups which the Nazis wished to eradicate. That distinction lay with the major death camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau in western Poland and Treblinka, where hundreds of thousands of people were gassed to death, over 1 million alone in the case of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Rather, Kraków-Płacow was strictly a concentration camp, insofar as it was a source of slave labor, and a camp where people were held or concentrated for periods of time until they were shipped out to Auschwitz or one of the other death camps. There were no gas chambers or crematoria here, as there were at these more notorious death camps. As such, Kraków-Płacow was primarily a way station before Polish Jews were sent off to Auschwitz, while it also functioned to produce war material and other goods for the German war effort or civilian population back in Germany. Goethe was a particularly sadistic administrator in all of this. When he organized the deportation of trainloads of the camp's Jewish children to Auschwitz, he would refer to them as being sent to kindergarten. This is not to suggest that no deaths occurred at Kraków-Płacow. Many thousands died there. A large proportion of these fatalities occurred owing to the appalling conditions of the camp, where diseases such as typhus ran riot. Others simply died of a combination of malnutrition and being overworked. The average daily ration of food for the Jewish inmates consisted of just a few hundred calories, typically comprised of watery soup and stale bread. When this inadequate diet was combined with a punishing daily work schedule of between 10 and 14 hours of hard labor, the inmates could only last for so long before their physical condition began to deteriorate sharply. Some agreed to collaborate with the camp authorities and became guards in order to acquire a double ration of food. However, a greater proportion of the deaths at Kraków-Płacow were owing to pure brutality. Infringements of the camp's rules or any effort at insubordination or attempt to escape could result in an immediate execution. These were carried out in a staged fashion, much of the time with the goal of terrorizing the camp's inmates by having them witness the systematic shooting of those who had dared disobey the rules or would not work hard enough. Central to this brutality, Amon Goethe would often order mass shootings as an example to the entire camp. Others later testified that he would regularly find reason to shoot somebody before he had even had his breakfast. In the daytime, during which Goethe was often quite drunk, he would parade through the camp with his 2 dogs, Rolf, a Great Dane, and Ralph, an Alsatian, who were trained to viciously attack individuals. Occasionally, shots were fired out of the window of Goethe's villa, where he lived in the center of the camp, at workers which he had observed as working too slowly. If one member of a work team committed an offense, Goethe saw to it that everyone was punished, the most brutal instance being when he killed every 5th member of a team from which one individual had seemingly escaped. These murders were often carried out at Chujowa Górka, a large hill in the camp where it is estimated that between 8,000 and 12,000 people were murdered in the 18 months or so that Kraków-Płacow was under the command of Goethe, or roughly 20 people per day. Unsurprisingly, the camp inmates were terrified of Goethe and often tried to hide when he walked about the camp. One survivor later testified that, "When you saw Goethe, you saw death." During Goethe's time at Lublin and the first months at Kraków-Płacow, the war effort more broadly for Germany and its allies was turning sour. In the summer of 1941, Hitler had decided to abandon the campaign, which had been initiated against Britain the previous year, of forcing it to surrender through a naval blockade and a major bombing campaign. Instead, the Nazis turned eastwards once again and invaded the Soviet Union. At first, the war on the Eastern Front was incredibly successful. By the late autumn, the Wehrmacht had advanced near to Moscow and Leningrad and had captured vast swathes of territory in Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, even considered negotiating a peace in which he would cede much of this captured territory to Germany. Yet he refrained from doing so, and as the bitter Russian winter set in, the German advance was stopped and hundreds of thousands of men began to freeze. By 1942, the Russians were pushing back, and a major victory in the southern city of Stalingrad in the autumn and winter of 1942 broke the deadlock. The Russians began pushing the Germans westwards in 1943. Moreover, the United States had entered the war in December 1941, and in the course of 1943, the Western Allies defeated the Italians and Germans in North Africa, and then opened a southern front in Europe in Italy. Defeat was now assured for the Nazis. Among Goethe's activities at Kraków-Płaszów and the camp more generally are perhaps much more well known today for having involved Oskar Schindler. Schindler was a German industrialist who hailed from the Sudetenland region and had something of a dissolute early adulthood, being arrested for public drunkenness on several occasions in the early 1930s and flitting from job to job. In the mid-1930s, he became involved with the Nazi movement in Czechoslovakia and became an informant to the party as it tried to gain influence in the Sudetenland region. His role as a party intelligence officer continued even after the Sudetenland was annexed. He was rewarded for his party activity in 1939 when he was given an enamelware factory in Kraków, and it was in this capacity that he would become involved in the events at the Kraków-Płaszów concentration camp. Schindler's factory was steadily staffed with Jewish slave laborers from the camp in the early 1940s, as the number of Polish Jews being detained and imprisoned steadily increased. Thus, there is an irony in that an individual who would eventually come to save many of the Jews at Kraków-Płaszów was paradoxically a long-standing Nazi himself. Schindler became the mastermind behind the rescuing of approximately 1,200 of Kraków-Płaszow's Jewish inmates, and perhaps many more indirectly, made famous by the 1993 Steven Spielberg film. Although Jewish labor was used in his factory in Kraków, he did not treat his workers poorly like so many other factory owners throughout the Reich did. In fact, he was especially kind to them, as he began spending large proportions of his own income and accumulated wealth from the factory in order to obtain black market goods and supplies to better feed and care for the workers and their families. Most significantly, he attempted to save hundreds of individuals. Often this was accomplished by bribing SS officers in the camp to refrain from killing workers or having them sent to Auschwitz or to one of the other death camps. Later, when a decision was taken to begin scaling back the size of Kraków-Płaszów as the Russians advanced towards Poland, Schindler convinced Goethe to allow him to move his factory and its workers to Bronieniec in Czechoslovakia. Goethe agreed on the basis of economic necessity, but for Schindler, what it meant was that he saved the lives of roughly 1,200 Jewish inmates of the camp, whose names he allegedly added to a list which may or may not have existed. These people would otherwise almost certainly have been executed or sent to one of the death camps, as Kraków-Płaszów was wound down. Schindler accomplished his valiant work even in the face of an increasing level of terror at Kraków-Płaszów. By mid-1944, the camp's population had increased to its largest size. Originally, it had housed just roughly 2,000 inmates, but at its peak, some 25,000 people were detained there, overseen by approximately 630 guards. And this was also the most intense period of the Holocaust throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and a large proportion of the 150,000 Jewish people who transited through Kraków-Płaszów on their way to the death camps was sent through here in the spring, summer and autumn of 1944. Moreover, Goethe's behavior continued to cast a pall of fear around the entire camp. Morning parades were now a common feature of life there. One morning, Goethe shot a man for being too tall. He then urinated on him as he lay dying. Sometimes prisoners would escape executions, but be whipped severely for not working hard enough. As one prisoner, Josef Bau, later reflected, Goethe was a hideous and terrible monster who set the fear of death in people. He ran the camp through extremes of cruelty that are beyond the comprehension of a compassionate mind. The intensification of the brutal activities at Kraków-Płaszów was occurring as the war was slowly drifting into its final stages. By mid-1944, the Russians were advancing into Poland. Hitler's Italian allies had decided to denounce their own leader, Benito Mussolini, and formed a new government in Rome which sided with the Allies. However, Mussolini was soon rescued by a mission sent by Hitler to central Italy, and a pro-German government was established in northern Italy, initiating a civil war in Italy on the southern front. Then, in the summer of 1944, the Western Allies, led by the United States and Britain, but with significant support from Canada and other nations, opened a long-planned Western Front in France, following the D-Day landings in Normandy. In the late summer and autumn of 1944, these landings were followed by the liberation of Paris and several other major cities in the Low Countries. By the time the winter of 1944 set in, the Western Allies were preparing for the final push into Western Germany, while the Russians were beginning their military build-up in Poland for a strike on Berlin in the spring of 1945. While the Russians advanced ever westwards, the camps in eastern Poland were beginning to be wound down and dismantled in the summer and autumn of 1944. For instance, on the 6th of August 1944 alone, Goethe shipped 7,500 Jewish women to Auschwitz, and just 4 days later over 4,500 Jewish men were sent to the Mauthausen concentration camp. This reduced the population of the camp to about half its size. However, Goethe had departed from Kraków-Płaszów before it was ever fully closed. By the summer of 1944, his conduct in running the camp was being investigated by the SS. Despite his supposed ideological adherence to the Nazi cause, Goethe had actually been profiting enormously from his role as commandant of Kraków-Płaszów. There was big money to be made in running one of the slave labor camps. Factories produced huge amounts of goods which, if siphoned off and sold on the black market, could result in a rich reward. Additionally, as inmates arrived to any of the concentration camps, they were generally stripped of their remaining possessions. Sometimes, valuable items of jewelry and gold and silver watches were found, and these were often claimed by the senior camp administrators as their own private loot. Such avenues of profit were exploited at most camps. Amon Goethe was no exception in profiteering from his time as commandant at Kraków-Płaszów. Since the spring of 1943, he had been accumulating money and goods which he sent westwards, often back to his wife and children or the offices of his parents' publishing firm in Vienna. This activity became even more frenzied at the camp as it became clear that it would be dismantled in 1944. And one of the reasons why Schindler was able to convince Goethe to allow him to move his factory and workers westwards into Czechoslovakia was that this action would provide Goethe with a smokescreen for also shipping some of his acquired goods westwards. Word of this corrupt activity on Goethe's part reached the authorities within the SS. It was combined with reports of Goethe holding wild drinking parties at the camp with his mistress Ruth Irena Calder and excessive brutality towards the inmates. The latter action was not criticized on humanitarian grounds. It was simply believed that Goethe should not have been killing workers who were still fit and healthy to be used as slave labor. And these accusations combined were enough to have him removed from his position as commandant of Kraków-Płaszów on the 13th of September 1944. He was sent back to Berlin to be prosecuted, but as the war effort was becoming ever more desperate, the charges were simply dropped in the winter of 1944 and he was released. Goethe had presided over the expansion of the camp at Kraków-Płaszów as well as its darkest days in 1943 and 1944. But now it was nearing its end. Administration of the camp had been placed in the hands of SS Obersturmführer Arnold Büscher following Goethe's departure. Under Büscher, the mass deportations which had begun under Goethe in the summer of 1944 continued until there were just a few thousand inmates and guards operating there by the early winter of 1944. The final flurry of activity centered on exhuming the remains of the thousands of bodies of individuals who had been executed in the camp during Goethe's reign of terror. These were dug up and their remains burnt on mass pyres. Similar scenes of SS officers attempting to destroy the evidence of the mass murders which had occurred at the concentration camps were seen throughout Eastern and Central Europe in the closing months of 1944. Finally, in January 1945, the few remaining camp authorities learned that the Soviets were closing on Kraków. Accordingly, they dismantled some of the last parts of the camps and fled. Unlike other camps where buildings, fences, guard towers and even considerable numbers of prisoners were found, when the Soviets arrived on the 20th of January 1945, they found little sign of any concentration camp at all having been at Kraków-Płaszów. As all of this was occurring, Goethe was moving wildly around Central Europe. Following the dropping of the charges against him and his release, Goethe's primary concern was to ensure that the ill-gotten wealth he had acquired through his corrupt dealings at Kraków-Płaszów was preserved. Accordingly, in the early spring of 1945, he was traveling around Central Europe, locating large shipments of goods which had been sent from eastern Poland. This included a visit to Oskar Schindler's new factory in Czechoslovakia, to try to retrieve some of what had been sent there during the relocation of the factory. However, as he was attempting these actions, Goethe was taken ill and ended up in a hospital initially for some chronic stomach problems he was having. But then he was subsequently moved to an SS medical facility where he was deemed to be mentally unfit. As a result, as it entered the late spring of 1945, Goethe was being detained in a mental institution in Bavaria, where he had spent so many years a decade earlier in exile. It was here he would witness the last stages of the war. The Second World War in Europe had entered its death throes in the winter of 1944. As the snow set in December, the Western Allies were preparing to build up their forces in Belgium, Luxembourg, and northeast France for a major offensive into Western Germany in the late winter. A final push by Hitler to counterattack into the Bastogne region saw some brief reverses for the Allies, but eventually the Battle of the Bulge ended in Allied victory in January 1945. Moreover, the concentration of some of Germany's last armies in Western Germany to attempt the counteroffensive drew resources away from the Eastern Front, and as the Russians moved into northwest Poland and northeast Germany in the opening months of 1945, they did so with remarkable speed. It was now a race to Berlin for the Allies. The Russians got there first, and it was they who laid siege to the city in the spring of 1945. Finally, surrounded and unwilling to surrender, Hitler killed himself in the Reich Chancellery bunker on the 30th of April 1945. His successor as head of the Nazi state, Joseph Goebbels, followed his example the following day. Exactly 1 week later, the chief of the Wehrmacht, Wilhelm Keitel, signed the official surrender of Germany, bringing the war in Europe to a conclusion. Goethe was a marked man in the aftermath of the war. The Americans, British and Russians had determined in the course of 1944 and early 1945 that there should not be excessive retribution sought against the German people in the aftermath of the war. Many Germans were simply innocent bystanders of a regime which had seized power with roughly the support of just 1/3 of the country in 1933. Moreover, even those who had fought in the Wehrmacht between 1939 and 1945 were more often than not young men who had been conscripted into service or who had shown minimal adherence to the Nazi ideological stance. Fewer still were guilty of actual war crimes or of having committed the worst atrocities associated with the regime. However, this clemency would only extend so far. Those who were at the top of the German government or who had been involved in committing war crimes were to be prosecuted to the full extent, while the SS, of which Goethe was a senior member, were all to be charged with crimes, as the most ideological branch of the Nazi Party and also the organization which had overseen the concentration camps and the mass murder of millions of Jewish people, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and other political dissenters. As such, Goethe would be prosecuted if captured. It did not take long for him to be apprehended, and there was no flight or attempt to evade capture. The former commandant of Kraków-Płaszów was still being held in a mental institution in Bavaria, and he was arrested there by the United States military. Goethe had donned the uniform of an ordinary rank-and-file German soldier in order to cover up his identity as a senior SS officer. As a result, he was not immediately detained as somebody who was to be prosecuted for war crimes and was sent to Dachau concentration camp nearby, which had been repurposed by the Allies as a holding center for German soldiers while they were being investigated to see if they were to be tried on any charges. Here he was finally identified by one Józef Jewkowicz. Jewkowicz had met Goethe several years earlier, in early 1943, when the Kraków-Płaszów camp was first being expanded after Goethe's arrival. At that time, Goethe had once pointed his gun at the teenage Jewkowicz's head.
He survived only because a Jewish policeman there assaulted the teenager and then told Goethe to save his bullet because Yevkovich was dead. Now, nearly 3 years later, he identified the man who had once nearly killed him. And once the Allies knew who he was, Goethe was extradited to Poland for prosecution. Goethe was sent to Poland in 1946 with Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, during much of the period of the Holocaust. While the major surviving leaders of the Nazi regime itself, such as Hermann Göring, Albert Speer and Joachim von Ribbentrop, were being tried at the main war crimes trial in Nuremberg in Germany, individuals such as Höss and Goethe, who had run the concentration camps on Polish soil and murdered hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens, were to be tried in Poland. Accordingly, Goethe's trial commenced in Warsaw on the 27th of August 1946. It lasted just 10 days. The Goethe that entered court was different to the one who had been arrested in Germany a year earlier. During the war, he had gained a lot of weight and drank heavily while he oversaw the camp at Kraków-Płaszów. The very fact that he had been admitted to a mental institution in the dying stages of the war is evidence enough of his shattered state of mind in early 1945. But as he entered the courtroom in Warsaw, he was more composed and had determined to provide his own defense and cross-examine witnesses himself. Nevertheless, there was no doubt from the very beginning that Goethe was going to be found guilty. The indictment, after all, directly accused him of being responsible for murdering at least 8,000 people at Kraków-Płaszów and other locations such as the Kraków ghetto. The prosecution called 70 witnesses over 10 days, many of which provided damning evidence of Goethe's actions at Kraków-Płaszów and elsewhere. Unlike Höss, who freely admitted during his trial that he had done what he did at Auschwitz, but who based his defense on the argument that he was simply following orders, Goethe consistently tried to deny the truth of the claims made against him. One of his arguments was that individuals were only shot at the camp if they were found to be in possession of explosives. It was all a paltry display, and even the few people that Goethe called as witnesses in his defense instead corroborated the prosecution witnesses' statements about Goethe's brutality. It was no surprise when, on the 5th of September, the court found Goethe guilty of all charges and sentenced him to be hanged. The execution was carried out just 8 days later. He was hanged on the grounds of the Kraków-Płaszów labor camp on the 13th of September 1946, after which his body was cremated and the ashes thrown into the Vistula River. He was survived by his wife and 2 surviving children. Annie Goethe had earlier applied for a divorce. He also had an illegitimate child, Monika Hertwig, through his affair with Ruth Calder. Ruth continued to defend Goethe and his actions for decades to come before committing suicide in 1983. But what of Goethe's binary opposite at Kraków-Płaszów? Oskar Schindler was briefly a fugitive after the war. Some of the Jewish people whose lives he had saved prepared letters for him to carry with him, attesting to his actions, but his fear was of falling into Russian hands. As such, he set off westwards with little more than the clothes on his back, having spent all the profits from his factory on bribes and black market goods earlier. Eventually, he and his wife made it to the American lines, and arrangements were made for a pardon. They settled down in Bavaria in the autumn of 1945, but much of the remainder of Schindler's life was turbulent. He suffered several business reverses, emigrated to Argentina with his wife in 1949, but then returned to Germany later without her after going bankrupt in 1958. A further bankruptcy followed back in Germany in 1963, as well as a heart attack, and continued poor health thereafter. However, Schindler was able to survive through these years based largely on donations from several of the Jewish people whose lives he had saved, and with whom he had maintained contacts over the years. When he died in October 1974, his body was taken to Jerusalem, where he was buried on Mount Zion. It would be hard to find another figure who stood in such absolute contrast to Amon Goethe. Amon Goethe was amongst the most brutal of the senior and mid-ranking members of the Nazi regime and the SS. What is perhaps striking about this is that there was not an abundance of evidence of how brutal his tenure as commandant of Kraków-Płaszów would be during his earlier life. The only child of a well-to-do couple who ran a prosperous Viennese publishing house. He certainly exhibited a rebellious streak from a young age, but there were few signs of overt brutality, although his political actions became more and more extreme as the years went by. We do not find him engaging in acts of overt violence throughout the late 1920s, while his terrorist activities in the 1930s were acts of direct political violence rather than exhibitions of pure sadism. Indeed, there were even significant periods of time during which he worked within the family business, and for nearly 3 years between 1934 and 1937, he effectively left the SS and was not an active member of the organization. Thereafter, when the war broke out, he performed several largely administrative roles before being transferred east to work in the growing network of officials charged with incarcerating Poland's Jews and either setting them to work as slave labor or deporting them to the death camps. It was during these years, in the early 1940s, that the already ideologically radical Amon developed the brutal streak which would characterize his reign at Kraków-Płasow. In Poland during the early 1940s, he observed his immediate superiors, figures such as Odilo Globocnik, terrorized the Jewish people over whose lives they exercised so much authority. Consequently, Goethe's time in Katowice and Lublin acted as a macabre training school for him to acquire the brutality which he deployed at Kraków-Płasow. Here he dehumanized the thousands of Jewish inmates and murdered people savagely on a whim, while others were beaten and tortured. All were psychologically traumatized by Goethe and his impulsive violence. Yet his reign at Kraków-Płasow also attests to the hypocrisy of the upper ranks of the SS. Before Kraków-Płasow was fully dismantled, its commandant was arrested for having profited extensively himself from the running of the camp, rather than filtering the camp's profits to the Nazi regime back in Berlin. Moreover, his reign there is lent a darker hue when it stands beside the noble actions of Oskar Schindler and his efforts to save as many of the Jews of Kraków-Płasow as he could. What do you think of Amon Goethe? Was he psychologically unbalanced all along? And does this explain some of his behavior? Or was he more of an ideological Nazi committed to the xenophobic policies of the Third Reich? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Rudolf Hess was born on the 26th of April 1894 in Ibrahimia, a suburb of the city of Alexandria in the Nile Delta of northern Egypt. His father was Johann Fritz Hess, the owner of Hess & Company, a large import-export business which shipped goods from Egypt to Germany, and had been founded in the 1860s to benefit from the new trade routes established by the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869, linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, and negating the need for ships to travel around Africa to get from Europe to Asia. Rudolf's mother was Clara Hess, the daughter of a wealthy textile industrialist in Germany who had met Johann as a result of their respective families' business interests. Rudolf was their first child. 2 others followed, a boy, Alfred, in 1897, and a girl, Margareta, after a long interval of 11 years in 1908. Rudolf was born in Egypt at an unusual time in the country's history. It had been a province of the Ottoman Empire for over 300 years, but during the course of the mid-19th century, Britain had gradually begun to unofficially take over Egypt in advance of the construction of the Suez Canal, a major project which was necessary for Britain to improve communications between London and the jewel of its empire, the British Raj of India. Thus, Hess effectively grew up in a British protectorate. Following the completion of the canal in 1869, many expat communities of merchants and traders from European countries popped up here, and the German community was significant enough in Alexandria that Hess was able to attend a German-language Protestant school there during his youth. His youth was formative and left him convinced of the racial superiority of people from countries like Germany and Britain, without whom Hess believed Egypt would be mired in pre-modern stagnation. He had already adopted that view by his teenage years,
at which time he was sent to Switzerland by his father to begin studying economics and finance with a view to taking over the family business in due course. He studied there for a year between 1911 and 1912 before heading to Germany to take up an apprenticeship in the city of Hamburg. While Rudolf was growing up in Egypt, Europe was becoming a place of growing tension. The German state had only recently come into existence. Prior to 1871, when the new German Empire was formed, Germany was a region made up of a few dozen smaller states, of which the largest was Prussia. When they were united in 1871, it upset the economic and political balance of Europe and Britain, but others were also perturbed by Germany's growing power. As a result, the European powers began dividing into two armed military alliances from the 1880s onwards, one centered on Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the other comprising Britain, France, and Russia. Years of escalating tension caused by military, economic, and colonial rivalry, as well as competition for land in regions such as the Balkans, saw the European diplomatic situation deteriorate precipitously. Then, in the summer of 1914, the heir to the throne of the Empire of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serb nationalist in the streets of Sarajevo, and the political crisis which ensued slowly escalated over a 5-week period until all of the major European powers declared war on each other by early August 1914. It was the beginning of the First World War, and a series of events which would have an enormous impact on Hess's life. At the time of the outbreak of the First World War, Hess was 20 years old and living in Germany, learning the family business. Within weeks, he had enlisted in the 7th Bavarian Field Artillery Regiment. His wartime service was extensive. For instance, he was soon involved in the First Battle of Ypres in the late autumn and early winter of 1914, one of the first major battles on the Western Front in northwestern France and Belgium, a region that would become the crucible of the entire war. He was soon earning promotions and awards for distinguished service, receiving the Iron Cross and being promoted to colonel in 1915. He then served at the bloody Battle of Verdun in France, which dragged on for most of 1916, before being posted to the Romanian front in the Balkans theatre in 1917. Throughout these periods of service, he was injured on several occasions, being hit by shrapnel multiple times, though these injuries were not extensive, and he was soon back in service after a few weeks' convalescence. By 1918, he had determined to become a fighter pilot in the new field of aviation combat, but by then the war had swung dramatically against Germany, following the entry of the United States on Britain and France's side. And in early November 1918, as supply shortages and political unrest ravaged Germany internally, the country was forced to surrender to the British, French, and US. The war was over, but the political scars which it created would continue to have drastic consequences for Europe. In the aftermath of the First World War, Germany entered a period of pronounced turmoil. In the closing stages of the war, Germany's imperial ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had abdicated. A German republic, named after the town its representatives first met in, Weimar, was declared, but the country was completely unstable for the 2 years that followed. For instance, German socialists and communists who were inspired by the communist revolution that had occurred in Russia in 1917 began launching insurrections themselves in cities such as Berlin and Munich across Germany. On the other side of the political spectrum, right-wing nationalists were determined to prevent the left-wing socialists seizing power and were also bitter about the result of the war. The problem was compounded as the Treaty of Versailles, which concluded the war in 1919, restricted Germany to having an army of 100,000 men. As a consequence of this, hundreds of thousands of German men, who otherwise would have remained in the military after the war ended, were demobilized. They began joining right-wing paramilitary organizations such as the Freikorps or Free Corps, which were engaging in running street battles against communists and other groups across Germany in 1919. In time, these gave way to new political groups, which were based on the idea of refuting Germany's post-war position and also finding scapegoats within German society to blame for the country losing the war. Many of these focused on the Jewish people as being responsible at a time when anti-Semitism was rife across nearly all of Europe. Hess soon became one of these young German men entering into extremist politics. He was discharged from the German army within weeks of the war ending, while he was further disillusioned by the collapse of the family business, which had been largely taken over by the British administration in Egypt during the war. Embittered, he gravitated towards both the Freikorps and the Tüller Society in early 1919, the latter of which was a new political group that was rabidly anti-Semitic and committed to the idea of resurrecting a sort of medieval German state which would dominate much of Central and Eastern Europe. By the beginning of the spring of 1919, he was active in both organizations in the Bavaria region of southern Germany, particularly in the regional capital of Munich, where there was a quasi-political war in process between right-wing groups such as the Freikorps and left-wing socialists who wanted to establish a communist state along the lines of that which was being fashioned in Russia following a political revolution there in 1917. Thus, Hess was involved in clashes between paramilitaries here in the spring and early summer of 1919. It was a formative period which would fashion Hess's political ideology as both a right-wing nationalist and as a committed anti-Semite. Germany's politics began to settle down eventually, as the new republic gained control of the situation in cities like Berlin, which had experienced its own attempted socialist coup in the Spartacist uprising of January 1919. As it did, the country began to prosper and enter a period of cultural vitality in the 1920s. However, the politics of Bavaria, and Munich in particular, continued to have an extreme edge to it. Out of the movements, such as those of the Tüller Society and the Freikorps, a new right-wing party emerged there in February 1920, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known more widely as the Nazi Party, was anti-Semitic, zealously nationalist, and committed to reversing the humiliation which its members believed had been inflicted on Germany according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Hess had enrolled in the University of Munich in 1919 and had been influenced while there by the teachings of Karl Haushofer, a professor of geopolitics who advocated for the idea that Germany should rejuvenate itself in the aftermath of the war by initiating new conflicts to acquire extensive Lebensraum, or living space, in Eastern Europe. He soon joined the Nazis and would bring this idea to the party in due course. Hess's private life also changed during these years. In the spring of 1920, while he was still studying at the University of Munich, he had met a fellow student by the name of Ilse Prohl. They soon began seeing each other, but it would be 7.5 years before they were married, an unusually long courtship by the standards of the 1920s. Moreover, even when they did marry, they did not start a family for another decade, and it was not until 1937 that Rudolf and Ilse would have their one and only child, a boy named Wolf Hess. If Hess's family life was limited, it was perhaps because he had become so devoted to the Nazi cause during the early 1920s in ways which would hinder his relationship with Ilse, although she shared his politics. Around the time he met his future wife, Hess had also heard a rising member of the Nazi Party, an Austrian veteran of the German army, Adolf Hitler, speak at a political meeting for the first time. Hess was impressed by his fiery rhetoric. So too were many others, and shortly afterwards Hitler rose to become the leader of the party, replacing its first chairman, Anton Drexler, in 1921. Hess soon struck up a close relationship with Hitler, one that would become very close in the years that followed, and it was through this that Hitler made the concept of acquiring Lebensraum in Eastern Europe central to Nazi ideology. Hess and Hitler's relationship would become closer still in the mid-1920s. This was owing to the events of the early winter of 1923. Between his first rise to power within the party in 1921 and the autumn of 1923, Hitler had become increasingly convinced that the party needed to seize power in Munich through a military coup along the lines of those that had been attempted in many parts of the country in 1919.
Thus, in the course of 1923, he and the other senior members of the party began planning an uprising in Munich, one which would be facilitated by the growing paramilitary wing of the Nazis, the Sturmabteilung or SA. The revolt was initiated on the 8th of November 1923, when over 2,000 Nazis and SA members tried to seize key locations in Munich, beginning with the Bürger Bräukeller beer hall in the city. However, the beer hall putsch, as it became known, was a shambles, and within hours the city authorities were able to establish a major police presence in Munich, which brought the city under control. Hitler fled the city, but was arrested 2 days later. Hess, who had been involved during the putsch in detaining city officials outside of Munich, fled in its aftermath, along with many others who had been involved, to Austria, but he was soon convinced to return and face sentencing. In the trials that followed throughout November and December 1923, Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a rather lenient punishment for the leader of an attempted coup. Hess was given 18 months. Both men were sent to Landsberg prison in the southwest of Bavaria. The Nazi Party was banned by the state government, but this would prove ineffective. In fact, the period of incarceration proved a formative one in the ascent to power of Hitler and the Nazis. While imprisoned at Landsberg, Hitler began dictating his political manifesto to both Hess and another Nazi member who was sentenced there with them, Emil Maurice. This sprawling, paranoid anti-Semitic treatise was subsequently entitled Mein Kampf, meaning My Struggle, and was published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926. By the time the first volume appeared in print, its author was already a free man. The Bavarian state government, elements of which were sympathetic to the views of the Nazis, decided to release Hitler from Landsberg in mid-December 1924, having only served a year of his sentence. Hess was released 10 days later, and within just 2 months, Hitler had also successfully petitioned the Bavarian government to lift the ban on the Nazis which had been imposed in the aftermath of the beer hall putsch. Thus, somewhat incredibly, these individuals and their party, which had attempted a military coup just over a year earlier, were able to once again go about their business from the spring of 1925 onwards. Hess had become an unofficial secretary to Hitler while incarcerated at Landsberg. This position was formalized in the aftermath of their release, as he was appointed private secretary to the Führer of the party in April 1925, with a fixed salary. It was the beginning of a period in which Hess would become known as Hitler's closest confidant, an individual who the leader always made time for, no matter what else was occurring. Indeed, the Nazis were wallowing in a political wilderness during the second half of the 1920s. The party had decided that they would attempt henceforth to seize power in Germany through the electoral system. But despite retaining a significant base of support in Bavaria and Munich in particular, they remained a party with only very limited support throughout Germany, despite the efforts of individuals such as Joseph Goebbels to establish new branches of the party in Berlin and elsewhere. Looking back today, it is difficult at times to remember what a collection of misfits, failures, and political hacks the Nazi leadership, of which Hess was a part, were in the late 1920s. They would have remained as such, a party with a very small base of support in Bavaria and little else, had it not been for the events of the autumn of 1929. That year, a momentous economic crisis struck the developed world following the collapse of the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City. A catastrophic economic depression followed, one which led to mass unemployment across Europe and the Americas during the early 1930s. In time, it would eventually lead to rapid inflation in some countries and the loss of people's life savings. Germany was particularly badly affected, and as millions of Germans suffered and became despondent, they began to adhere to more extreme political groupings in their country. And as this occurred, the Nazis, who had garnered a tiny percentage of the vote in elections up to that point, gradually became more and more popular. Thus, when the Reichstag elections were held in September 1930, the party increased its vote percentage from about 2.5% nationally to over 18%. As a result, Hitler and his adherents claimed 107 seats in the 577-seat Reichstag.
it was the beginning of a dreadful political revolution in Germany. Hess continued to acquire greater influence within the Nazi Party as it was beginning to grow massively in popularity in the early 1930s. As the private secretary and spokesperson for Hitler, Hess found himself traveling the country with the Nazi leader as Hitler addressed huge audiences at political rallies across Germany, while the party gained ever more supporters. This placed Hess in a powerful position, where he could effectively control who had access to Hitler, a man fast becoming the most powerful politician in Germany, and one whom many people believed was effectively a chancellor in waiting. As he could ensure individuals access to Hitler, or at least that their message or request for an audience would be passed on to the Führer, Hess developed significant powers of patronage, and all of this began to lead to greater official titles. Eventually, in 1932, he was placed in charge of the party liaison staff, a role which meant that he effectively controlled personal access to Hitler during campaigning, as well as being appointed chairman of the party's Central Political Commission. This meant Hess was largely the senior administrator within the Nazi Party by 1932, although others, such as the head of the SS Heinrich Himmler and the chief propagandist Goebbels, did admittedly have more control over policy matters. Hess was about to ascend to a position of considerable significance within Germany. This would be based on the Nazis' final seizure of power. By 1932, the economic situation in the country had become terminal, as the Great Depression showed no signs of abating. German banks were on the brink of collapse, and the political situation was in freefall. Then, that summer, new Reichstag elections were held. In these, the first since September 1930, the Nazis once again increased their support dramatically, doubling their vote to 37% and claiming 230 seats in the 608-seat Reichstag. Yet this was not an outright majority, and the centrist political parties were unwilling to do business with the Nazis if it meant Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany. As a consequence, a technocratic government was cobbled together, one which attempted to govern the country for a few months. However, this too proved ineffective, and new elections in November 1932 allowed Hitler to stoke fears amongst political centrists about the rise of the Communist Party of Germany. Thus, early in 1933, an agreement was reached between the Nazis, political centrists, and the leaders of the German business community that Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany in an effort to provide a more stable government and concretely address the economic situation. Unbeknownst to many of those who facilitated this, it was effectively a death sentence for the German Republic. Within weeks, Hitler used his new position to manufacture a political crisis, and used that to pass an enabling act, which allowed himself and his fellow Nazis to effectively rule by decree. The Weimar Republic was over, and the Nazi Third Reich had commenced. Rudolf Hess had become a significant figure within the Nazi Party during the late 1920s and early 1930s, based to a considerable extent on his personal relationship with Hitler and then on his promotion to a number of significant official positions within the party apparatus. However, this all paled into insignificance with his ascent following the Nazis' seizure of power in Germany in the spring of 1933, the extent of which must have surprised many within the Nazi senior hierarchy itself. Just weeks after the passage of the Enabling Act, Hitler appointed Hess as one of the 16 Reichsleiters who were created at this time. These Reichsleiters, or empire leaders, were effectively the senior members of the Nazi Party, who made up the new governing body of Germany. Most of them were also individuals who were appointed to ministerial positions within the new German government, and this indeed was a distinction which was awarded to Hess shortly afterwards, when, on the 1st of December 1933, he was made a minister without portfolio. This was a striking rise to official political office for an individual who had only first won a seat in the Reichstag in fresh elections which were held in fraudulent circumstances in March 1933, after Hitler had been appointed as Chancellor. However, all of these promotions in 1933 were dwarfed by the decision in the months following his ascent as Chancellor by Hitler to appoint Hess as Deputy Führer, or Deputy Leader of the Nazi Party, in mid-April 1933. The significance of this might have been lost on individuals such as Himmler, Goebbels, or another contender to become second in command of the government, Hermann Göring, at this stage. But if they were in any doubt as to Hess's seniority, this was displaced in September 1933 when Hitler decreed that Hess should cease to be termed a Reichsleiter and instead be addressed henceforth as the Deputy Führer, in acknowledgement of his seniority amongst the other Nazi leaders. What this meant was that Hess was effectively Hitler's designated successor at this time, should anything happen to the Nazi leader. And it was in this capacity that he began acquiring an ever greater list of powers in the mid-1930s, monopolizing control over many aspects of Nazi policy relating to finances, health and education. He was also responsible for the signing of legislation into law and for organizing political events throughout Germany, notably the massive Nazi rallies which were organized at the city of Nuremberg annually after their seizure of power in 1933. Hess also had extensive powers to monitor individuals who were deemed enemies of the party. As such, Hess's position in Germany expanded greatly in line with his appointment as Deputy Führer. We might ask at this point exactly how ideologically committed to the Nazi cause Hess was. Was he a virulent anti-Semite and German nationalist, or was he primarily a zealous follower of Hitler above all else? The answer is both. There is no doubt that Hess was personally committed in an almost fanatical fashion to Hitler, but there is also no disputing the fact that he was committed to the same ideological values as his master too. Hess, for instance, needed no convincing that Germany's recent history needed to be viewed through the prism of a Jewish conspiracy to destroy the country. For instance, he viewed the League of Nations, which had been set up to ensure international peace in the aftermath of the First World War, as an instrument of an international Jewish plot, and also perceived many of Germany's enemies, such as the Soviet Union, as being controlled by Jewish politicians. It is interesting to speculate, given his pronounced paranoid delusions in these respects, exactly to what extent Hess had influenced some of Hitler's views that he stated in Mein Kampf years earlier. Moreover, Hess was also passionately convinced of the need to rejuvenate Germany and of the racial superiority of the German people over others, such as the Slavs of Poland and Eastern Europe. While he may have been a zealous adherent of Hitler's, Hess did not need any convincing about the merits of the Nazis' racial ideology. Hess was far from alone in his ideological stance, and the first years of the Nazi regime's reign in Germany saw a series of virulently anti-Jewish laws introduced into the country. On the 15th of September 1935, the Reichstag, which had become little more than a showpiece designed to rubber stamp what Hitler and the other senior Nazi leaders had already decided upon, passed a series of legislation aimed at the persecution of Germany's 500,000 Jewish citizens. The Nuremberg Laws, as they became known, effectively robbed Germany's Jews of their rights in Germany. Indeed, depending on the bloodline of the country's Jews, they were officially deprived of their citizenship. Other elements of the legislation forbade Jews from marrying non-Jewish Germans, while Jews were also heavily regulated in terms of their ability to employ non-Jewish Germans. Numerous measures were also put in place to restrict the Jewish community's ability to conduct business. The Nuremberg Laws were the first major step in a series of escalating persecutory measures which the Nazi state would implement in the coming years, culminating in the pre-war period in the infamous Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass, of November 1938, when thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues were attacked and tens of thousands of Jews were either killed, attacked, or detained. Because of his newfound position of seniority within Germany and his closeness with Hitler, Hess would also have been central to deliberations in the mid-1930s around German rearmament. One of the most significant terms of the Treaty of Versailles that had brought the First World War to an end was that Germany was restricted to an army, henceforth of no more than 100,000 troops, while it was completely prohibited from having an air force and anything other than a token navy. The Weimar government had exceeded these figures by keeping tens of thousands of troops enlisted in an unofficial capacity, but the German army remained small throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. The Nazis quickly set about reversing this situation, arguing on the international stage that Germany had been humiliated for long enough and that it was only right that it should be allowed to move on from the war which had ended 15 years earlier. Berlin made an announcement in early 1935 that it would begin recruiting hundreds of thousands of men into a new German army, while a German air force, to be called the Luftwaffe, was also to be established. Thus, within a short period of time, the Nazis began rearming their country, and in the spring of 1936, they moved troops into the Rhineland of Western Germany, a region which they were prohibited from placing troops in under the terms of Versailles. It was the beginning of the march to a war of revenge, which Hitler had desired since 1918. Hesse's role in German affairs continued to expand as this rearmament process was underway. In 1933, he had been placed in charge of establishing the Volksdeutscher Rat, meaning the Council of Ethnic Germans, a body which was responsible for reaching out to ethnic German communities living outside the borders of Germany, notably in places like Austria, the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and Western Poland. Some of these regions had formed part of Germany prior to the First World War, and the council was established with a view to improving Nazi relations with the German communities here in advance of reacquiring direct control of these territories, whether through diplomatic means or through war. Hess oversaw the management of the council and efforts within it to disrupt the politics of Germany's neighbours and agitate for a return of lands lost in 1918. He was also directly involved during these years in the drafting of the Nuremberg Laws and other legislation aimed against groups such as Romani people and Jehovah's Witnesses, who the Nazis were also hateful of. He also acted increasingly as Hitler's representative in negotiations and conferences with the heads of the German business community, notably the presidents of companies such as IG Farben, Krups, and others which were deeply in league with the Nazis. Hess was Hitler's right-hand man as the march to war escalated in the late 1930s. As we have seen, the regime had begun rearming in 1935. This escalated in early 1938 as Berlin began to try to reclaim lands which it had lost in 1918, and other lands which the Nazis wanted to form into a greater Germany through aggressive diplomacy. This had been underway in many ways since 1933 in Austria, where the Austrian Nazi Party had attempted to undermine successive governments in Vienna. A different form of Austrian fascism emerged to fend off Germany's efforts to subsume the country, but by early 1938, German interference had become so intense that a referendum was declared on the matter of uniting the country with Germany. Preempting the result of this, Hitler ordered the German army into Austria in mid-March 1938. No major violence occurred, but the measure ensured that the union of the two countries, known as the Anschluss, was voted through easily days later. Thereafter, Hitler began pressing claims to much of Czechoslovakia, a country which was effectively annexed in two intervals in late 1938 and the spring of 1939, as Britain and France tried to avoid a new war by appeasing Hitler. However, when Czechoslovakia was fully dismembered in March 1939, it was clear that any further act of aggression would mean war. Thus, when the Nazis invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France responded by declaring war in turn on Germany. The Second World War had commenced. Hess's roles changed substantially with the outbreak of the conflict. He became increasingly involved, for instance, in the measures being taken to organize the occupation of Poland in the autumn and winter of 1939, following a swift, successful military campaign in September and early October.
Much of this revolved around identifying the country's 3.5 million Jewish people and preparing for their persecution under German rule. For instance, Hess was responsible for overseeing the establishment of a registry of all Polish Jews, and also the adoption of policies which would effectively commence the creation of Lebensraum in Poland by stripping the current inhabitants of the region of their rights. Thus, Hess's sphere of activity increased to include administrative responsibilities in Poland. Much of this was against his own inclinations, and Hess wanted to be more active in combat. The Deputy Führer had a lifelong interest in aviation, having signed up to join the nascent German Air Force in 1918 towards the end of the First World War. He had subsequently learned to fly in the late 1920s and participate in aviation races throughout the 1930s. Consequently, when Hitler initiated the war in September 1939, Hess had sought to join the Luftwaffe and to fly active missions in the war. Yet Hitler had forbidden this, stating that Hess was too important a figure within the regime to risk his life flying standard aviation missions. This prohibition was later reduced to a one-year ban, but when Hess finally took to the skies during the war, it would be for an altogether stranger mission than he had envisaged in 1939. The Second World War was a slow conflict at first. Poland was conquered by the Nazis in a matter of weeks, and thereafter there were months of inaction on all sides as Britain and France tried to rearm as quickly as possible. This belated effort on their part proved costly, and when Hitler finally ordered the German Wehrmacht westwards in the spring of 1940, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries and France were all conquered in a matter of a few months. Thus, by the late summer that year, the Nazi state stood in control of virtually all of Central Europe and much of Western Europe, while those states in these regions which remained outside of Nazi control, such as Italy, Switzerland and Spain, were either allies or neutral in the war. Only Britain stood against Germany, and that late summer and autumn, a massive campaign began by land and sea to bomb the country and choke off its resources to force London to submit. This latter campaign, which has come to be known by various terms such as the Blitz, meaning the bombing of British cities by the German Air Force, the Battle of the North Atlantic, to refer to the German Navy's efforts to strangle Britain's supply lines by attacking its merchant navy at sea, and the Battle of Britain more broadly, would provide the backdrop to one of the defining episodes of Rudolf Hess's life. During the course of 1940 and early 1941, Hess and Hitler's relationship began to deteriorate. This was not because of a major incident or falling out between the pair. Rather, it was simply that Hess was deprived of the personal contact and interaction with the Führer, which so much of his career and position had been based on since the mid-1920s. The reason for this was Hitler was now largely basing himself out of military compounds in Germany and Poland as he prepared for a vast invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. As he spent more time absent from Berlin and Munich, where Hess continued his administrative work, the pair interacted less and less. It was at this particular juncture that Hess began making plans to engage in one of the most peculiar acts of the entire Second World War. From the early autumn of 1940, Hess began initiating contact with the Duke of Hamilton, with a view to having him act as an intermediary with King George VI of Britain. Hess believed they could collectively initiate peace proceedings between Nazi Germany and Britain. Hess's motives in doing so, which were kept secret from Hitler and all the other Nazi leaders, and which were effectively treasonous as a result, seemed to have been born out of his concern regarding the feasibility of invading the Soviet Union without first ending the war with Britain. Hess's efforts on this issue continued through the autumn and winter of 1940. By this time, he had come to believe that King George was effectively opposed to the British government, led by the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, concerning the commitment to continue the war with Germany. As such, he believed it would be possible to use Hamilton as an intermediary with the king and establish peace with Britain. To that end, in November 1940, Hess began making preparations to fly to Britain himself piloting a Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighter bomber plane. As part of this, he began customizing one of these planes to increase its fuel load and fit it with equipment he might need for his mission. And then, on the 10th of May 1941, Rudolf Hess, the deputy leader of Nazi Germany, set off on a solo flight from Germany over the North Sea towards Britain. Just over 5 hours later, having been detected by the RAF and running short of fuel, he parachuted out of his plane in the skies over southern Scotland at 23:06 p.m. local time. Hess later described his pride in having successfully made it to Britain on his mission. He didn't last long unhindered though. Less than an hour after landing, he was apprehended and detained south of Glasgow. Following his initial detention, Hess claimed to be a German officer called Alfred Horn. Posing as this individual, he then requested to be allowed to meet with the Duke of Hamilton. It was only when this request was granted and he met with Hamilton the following day that Hess revealed his true identity and disclosed the purpose of his mission. The Deputy Führer must have been surprised when Hamilton did not have as positive a reaction as Hess had been led to believe he would have to his mission. Instead, Hamilton headed south to disclose what had occurred and to confer with Churchill in London. Here it was determined that Hamilton would meet with Hess again at Buchanan Castle in Stirlingshire in Scotland, where he had been detained. Thus, a second meeting was organised, at which Hess detailed his proposals for peace. Hess believed a mutually beneficial dispensation could be arrived at if Britain made peace with Germany. Through this, Germany was to be given free rein to rule the European continent, while Britain would be allowed to retain its independence and also control over its vast overseas empire. As Hess saw it, it was a logical mutual agreement for the British and Germans, two of the racially advanced European nations, to come to. His captors, however, disagreed, and it became clear to Hess in the days that followed that his mission had been completely in vain. Meanwhile, back in Germany, news of Hess's unsanctioned mission had reached Hitler by midday on the 11th of May, just 12 hours after Hess had parachuted to the ground in Scotland. It was delivered via a letter Hess had prepared prior to his departure. Despite Hess outlining his reasons for his mission and trying to justify them on the basis that they were in Germany's best interests and favourable to the war effort, Hitler reacted furiously. He quickly stripped Hess of all his positions, abolishing the position of Deputy Führer and assigning his duties to Martin Bormann, another senior administrator within the regime. In an effort to manage the political fallout, a bizarre program of arresting and persecuting astrologers and faith healers whom Hess had been known to consult was also initiated in order to suggest that the Deputy Führer had acted as he had after being influenced by occultists of some kind. Thus, Hess was completely disowned by the Nazi regime as a result of his mission. In Britain, his situation was equally dispiriting. After learning that his mission had been futile, he was briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London before being sent to Mitchett Place in Surrey, a fortified mansion designated as Camp Z, where he would spend nearly a whole year under house arrest. Hess's first years in detention in Britain would see the course of the war begin to shift dramatically. When he first flew into Scotland in the early summer of 1941, the Nazis had reached a position of enormous strength, having conquered a vast part of Europe from the Bay of Biscay in western France east to Poland and the western parts of what is now Ukraine, and from the northern stretches of Norway south to the Balkans. Campaigns were also underway to conquer Greece and North Africa in conjunction with Hitler's ally, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. However, just 6 weeks after Hess landed in Britain, Hitler initiated a vast invasion of the Soviet Union. At first, this went very well for Germany, and it seemed that the Nazis would soon be able to force the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to cede most of Eastern Europe to them as well. But that winter, the German Wehrmacht began to meet with more determined resistance in Russia outside the cities of Moscow and Leningrad. Then, in December 1941, the United States entered the war against the Nazis after it was attacked by Hitler's other major ally, the Empire of Japan. Thus,
In 1942, ominous reversals of fortune began for Hitler and his accomplices, as the campaigns in both North Africa and on the Eastern Front in Russia began to shift in the favor of the Allies. Things were faring no better for Hess in Britain. At Mitchard Place in Surrey, he was under house arrest. His circumstances here were comparatively favorable to those of an average German prisoner of war in Britain, and certainly better than those of the average prisoner of war in German custody on the continent. For instance, Hess was allowed to move freely about the rather pleasant surroundings of much of the mansion house and was able to write home to his family in Germany. The major deprivations were that he could not listen to the radio or read the newspapers, and the mansion and grounds were guarded by over 150 armed soldiers. This information blackout ensured that Hess did not receive any news about the course of the war, which he might be able to use to manipulate his situation. Yet, despite the rather pleasant circumstances in which he was imprisoned, Hess's psychological state was deteriorating throughout the spring and early summer of 1942, as he claimed that secret forces with special psychic powers were attempting to control figures like Churchill. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Nazi in Hess associated these secret forces with a Jewish plot. There is debate to this day, though, as to whether or not Hess was feigning his psychological deterioration. One of the terms of the Geneva Convention on the Treatment of War Prisoners stipulated that those who were mentally incapacitated had to be repatriated to their home nation, and Hess was possibly trying to get back to Germany through this loophole. In mid-June 1942, Hess's situation changed considerably. Early on the morning of the 16th, he attempted to commit suicide, or at least make it seem as though he were attempting to take his own life, by jumping over a railing of a staircase at Mitchard Place and falling onto a stone floor below. The fall didn't kill him, but he did fracture his left leg. Thus, he was forced to use crutches for weeks thereafter, and a decision was taken based on his deteriorating mental health and increasing assertions that he was being poisoned at the Mansion House to send him to Mayndiff Court Hospital in southeastern Wales on the 26th of June 1942. Hess would spend the remaining 3 years of the war confined here. His circumstances didn't really improve while there. The surroundings were certainly less pleasant, though as the war continued to go favorably for the Allies, Hess was increasingly allowed access to the newspapers and given a radio. He complained regularly of suffering from a wide range of ailments related to his internal organs, complaints which his physicians, who at first were unaware that Hess was a lifelong hypochondriac, might have taken seriously at first, but soon learned to ignore. Thus did the former Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany spend the last 3 years of the Second World War. By this time, the war was heading towards an inexorable conclusion. In late 1942, one of the most significant clashes of the entire conflict had been fought between the Germans and the Russians for control of the southern Russian city of Stalingrad. It had ended in the first disastrous German defeat of the entire war. Then, in the spring of 1943, with a large injection of US personnel and supplies, the Western Allies were able to gain victory in the North Africa campaign, forcing the Italians and Germans out of both Libya and Tunisia. That summer, they followed up on this by opening a southern front in Sicily in southern Italy. However, this proved to be a more limited new front compared to the one which was opened in Western Europe in the summer of 1944 following the D-Day landings in Normandy. Within weeks, the Allies were able to liberate Paris, just as the Russians advanced into Poland. By the end of 1944, despite a last, desperate counteroffensive by Hitler in the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, that December, the Western Allies were preparing to invade the Rhineland early in 1945, as the Russians began their military build-up in Poland in advance of invading eastern Germany. The war was effectively over. It was simply a race to see who would capture Berlin first. Back in Britain at Mayndiff Court Hospital, Hess was not responding well to news of developments on the continent. On the 4th of February 1945, he attempted to commit suicide for a second time by stabbing himself with a blunt bread knife. By that time, he was aware that the Russians were advancing on Berlin from the east of the country, and the British, Americans and other Western allies were attempting to make their descent on the German capital as well before the war ended. Perhaps it is a sign of his mental decline that Hess believed the bread knife could ever inflict a sufficient enough wound to kill himself, and the surface gash required little more than 2 stitches afterwards. Thereafter, he engaged in a hunger strike. However, this too was abandoned when he was informed that he would be force-fed if he continued on that path. By now, the British government was determined to keep Hess alive for the purposes of having him appear at the major war crimes trial which was being planned for the Nazi leadership once the conflict was over. They were sorely in need of senior members of the regime to stand trial as the war drew to a conclusion. As with Berlin surrounded by the Russians in late April 1945, Hitler killed himself on the 30th, and his designated successor, Goebbels, followed suit a day later on the 1st of May. Thus, although he had been in custody in Britain for 4 years by the time the war in Europe officially came to an end on the 8th of May 1945, Hess would be one of the senior defendants at the planned War Crimes Tribunal. Hess was repatriated to Germany in the autumn of 1945 for the purposes of standing trial before the International Military Tribunal, which had been established to oversee the war crimes trials at the city of Nuremberg after the war. He was to be tried along with the remaining senior members of the Nazi regime in the headline first trial, individuals such as the head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor for much of the war, Hermann Göring, the head of the Wehrmacht, Wilhelm Keitel, the War Economy Minister and Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, and the head of the General Government of occupied Poland, where the Holocaust of millions of Europe's Jews had primarily been carried out after Hess's flight to Scotland in May 1941, Hans Frank. There were 23 men involved in all in the trial. Generally, these individuals were to be tried with having incited the war, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and broad violations of the laws governing warfare. The trial, watched intently by the world's media, would be held at Nuremberg from November 1945 onwards and lasted nearly 11 months. Hess was in poor physical condition when he arrived to Nuremberg in the autumn of 1945. He weighed little more than 10 stone and was paranoid that his captors in Britain had been poisoning his food. As a result, he had brought samples of what he had been fed with him to Germany with the goal of presenting them as evidence of his mistreatment in Britain. But these were immediately confiscated. When the time for the trial came, he started to claim that the amnesia he was suffering from already in Britain had worsened. Moreover, he refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the court, claiming that the entire tribunal was effectively a show trial, at the end of which he expected himself and all of his fellow defendants to be found guilty and executed. He was wrong in this. While Göring and several others who had a clear and direct hand in the Holocaust of the continent's Jewish people and other groups such as the Romani were indeed sentenced to death, others were spared. Hess was amongst them. While he was deemed to be guilty of having helped to incite the war, his defense lawyer argued that Hess could not be held responsible for the Holocaust and other war crimes which had largely occurred after Hess made his flight to Scotland and was imprisoned. Accordingly, he was sentenced to life in prison, but spared the death penalty. Hess began serving his sentence at Spandau Prison in western Berlin in July 1947. He was confined there with 6 others who had been placed on trial with him at Nuremberg, including Speer, the foreign minister Konstantin von Neurath, and the 2 senior heads of the German Navy under the Nazis, Karl von Donitz and Erich Raeder. The prisoners were held under difficult circumstances early on, with strict rules forbidding them from conversing with one another and severe limitations on their access to writing materials. As time went by, these restrictions were loosened. Hess, however, remained a broken figure. He continued to believe his food was being poisoned, refused to have any visitors, and was known to cry out in his sleep. Despite this situation, he continued to be confined at Spandau. As an assessment in 1957, deemed him well enough not to warrant being sent to a psychiatric unit. Moreover, the prison was gradually emptying. 4 of Hess's fellow Nazi prisoners were released in the mid-1950s, having either served their sentences or on the grounds of severe ill health. The final 2 others, Albert Speer and Baldur von Schirach, who had been the Nazi governor of occupied Vienna, were released together on the 30th of September 1966, having both served their 20-year sentences. Thus, henceforth, Spandau Prison, which had 600 cells, housed Rudolf Hess as its sole prisoner from 1966 onwards. 3 years after Speer and von Schirach left Spandau, things began to change slightly. Although for many years he had been in contact with his wife Ilse and son Wolf, as well as his daughter-in-law Andrea, whom he had never met in person, he had repeatedly declined their requests to visit him. But following a period of illness in 1969, when he was moved briefly to a medical hospital to treat a perforated ulcer, he relented and allowed them to visit. It was the first time he had seen his wife and son since 1941. Thereafter, many individuals began to petition for his release, particularly as he began to suffer from many different ailments, including prostate cancer. However, these would all be declined on the grounds that Hess had never shown any remorse for his actions and was still a committed anti-Semite. His unwillingness to feign some remorse to advance the case for his release was just one aspect of Hess's unrelentingly peculiar approach to those who visited him. For instance, when historians showed up to interview him in an effort to better understand why he had flown into Britain in 1941 without telling anyone in the Nazi leadership what he was doing, Hess would tell them he had been inspired to do so by supernatural forces which visited him in a dream. Rudolf Hess was found dead on the 17th of August 1987 in a room in the garden at Spandau Prison, which had been converted to allow him a summer reading room. He had apparently hanged himself using an extension cord which he had strung over the latch of one of the windows of the room. Although a suicide note was found on his person, and the Allied bodies, which had been charged with overseeing Spandau Prison for 4 decades, quickly ruled his death a suicide, some doubts were raised at the time. Hess, after all, was in his early 90s by that time, and many people believed he could not possibly have managed to hang himself. However, there seems little reason to think otherwise. Why would any other power with access to Spandau have suddenly decided to kill him after 40 years of being imprisoned there? Additionally, it was noted at the time that Hess's mental state had never been good, and he had previously attempted suicide at Spandau in 1977. Following his death, Spandau Prison, of which he had been the sole prisoner for 21 years, was demolished to prevent it becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. Rudolf Hess was in many ways the last of the senior Nazis to die. Rudolf Hess is one of the strangest of all the senior members of the Nazi regime to assess. While many studies have often commented on his personal relationship with Hitler, there is also no doubting he was an ideological Nazi, one who was both a committed right-wing nationalist and an anti-Semite, while also espousing the racial hierarchy which allowed the Nazis to have no compunctions about mass murdering millions of Jews, Poles, Romani, Russians, and other peoples across Europe during the Second World War. Moreover, he was absolutely central to the operations of the party once the Nazis seized power in 1933, overseeing the passage of legislation and even drafting parts of notorious ones such as the Nuremberg Laws. While subsequent events would complicate his reputation, there is no doubting that Hess was every bit as committed to the Nazi ideology as Hitler, Himmler, or Goebbels. Indeed, we will never know how much he might have influenced some of Hitler's own ideas as he was drafting Mein Kampf at Landsberg Prison in 1924. Despite all of this, Hess is more difficult to assess than figures like Himmler and Goebbels. This is all because of the events of May 1941, when Hess decided to fly on a solo mission to Britain with the goal of initiating peace talks between Britain and Nazi Germany. His mission was a complete failure, but because of it, many people have judged Hess less harshly than some of his associates within the Nazi leadership. but there seems to be little reason to do so. Hess's actions might have been driven by his declining mental health, but they were nevertheless quite in line with Nazi ideology. The Deputy Führer was not trying to bring about peace in Europe through his mission. He was simply trying to ensure that Britain was no longer an adversary before Germany went to war with Russia. Given the apocalyptic plans which the Nazis had for Eastern Europe, had they defeated the Soviet Union, there is little sense in finding some redeeming quality in Hess's efforts to simply shore up Germany's western borders in order to more effectively wage war in the East. Moreover, Hess never showed any remorse for his actions and remained committed to much of the Nazis' ideology down to his death, more than 4 decades after the war ended. He lived and died a full-blooded Nazi throughout his life, and neither his complicated psychology nor his actions in 1941 changed that. What do you think of Rudolf Hess? Should he be judged in the same way that the other senior members of the Nazi regime have been? Or do his curious actions in heading to Scotland in 1941 to initiate peace talks exonerate him to some extent of his crimes? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Joachim von Ribbentrop was born on the 30th of April 1893 in the city of Wesel near the Dutch border in what was then the province of Rhenish Prussia in the Rhineland region of Western Germany. He was born simply as Joachim Ribbentrop. It was only when he was adopted by a relative with noble blood in later life that he became known as Joachim von Ribbentrop. His father was Richard Ulrich Friedrich Joachim Ribbentrop. Richard was an army officer, a lieutenant in the Westphalian Field Artillery, and his work ensured that the Ribbentrops travelled around quite a bit. As we will see, much of Joachim's ascent to political office in later life was based on his ability to speak several languages and his knowledge of other countries, faculties he developed early in life on account of his father's profession. His mother was Johanna Sophie Hertwig, who went by the name of Sophie. Together, she and Richard had 3 children. Lothar, the eldest, was born in 1890. Their second son, Joachim, was born in 1883, and a daughter, Ingeborg, arriving in 1896. The Ribbentrops moved quite a lot from very early in Joachim's life. When he was still a boy, they relocated to Castle Wilhelmshöhe, near the town of Kassel. In the late 19th century, it was not common for one to acquire a position as an officer in the German army unless one was possessed of a certain level of wealth. Lieutenant Richard Ribbentrop did not possess such wealth, and as such must have been unusually well qualified in order to attain this position. However, the fact that the Ribbentrops lived ensconced in a world of well-to-do military families, many of whom were members of the minor Prussian and German nobility, seems to have had a significant impact on Joachim during his youth, and he would spend much of his later life trying to acquire the trappings of wealth and nobility. This disposition as a social climber, which he acquired as a result of this upbringing, would one day go on to account for much of his desire to first join and then rise within Germany's Nazi Party in the 1930s. Joachim's childhood was also dysfunctional in other ways. His mother, Sophie, suffered from tuberculosis. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tuberculosis was still a deadly disease with few known treatments. It was also contagious, a fact which saw Sophie Ribbentrop often spending much of her time in bed and away from her children, for fear of passing the disease to them. In the end, her efforts in this regard were unsuccessful. Her eldest child, Lothar, caught the disease and eventually died from it years later. It is also highly likely that Joachim became tubercular himself at a young age. Consequently, when he was 18 years old, one of his kidneys was removed, and it seems likely that this was to prevent the further spread of the disease through his system. This left Ribbentrop with a droop to one of his eyelids, which was related to the infected kidney. Beyond these personal health matters, the death of Lothar years later affected him badly. The pair had been close and relied on each other in a family dynamic where Lieutenant Ribbentrop was a cold and distant presence. As a result, in his late teenage years, Joachim was increasingly isolated as the family continued to move from place to place due to his father's reassignments to different bases and garrisons. In 1901, Richard Ribbentrop was promoted to the position of major, and the family was once again uprooted from Kassel to go and live in Metz, a town in eastern France today, but one which had become part of the German Empire in 1871, following the annexation of the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine by Prussia at the end of the brief Franco-Prussian War. The Ribbentrops remained here for the next 7 years. In 1902, Sophie Ribbentrop finally succumbed to her tuberculosis and died, following which Richard remarried to Olga Margareta von Prittwitz, an affable woman but one whom Joachim did not warm to. From 1904, when he was 11 years old, Joachim was sent to school in the Lycée Faber in Metz. Here he failed to excel. One teacher noted that he was overconfident in his abilities, and this confidence did not match his actual performance. At the end of one winter term, he came 32nd amongst a group of 50 boys, a performance which resulted in a beating from his father. However, despite his poor academic performance, others who remembered him from this time later related that Joachim did possess a level of charm which saw him get away with things that the other boys simply could not. This ability to ingratiate himself with his superiors, despite the lack of substance in his character, was one which he would utilize throughout his life. In 1908, a major shift occurred for the Ribbentrops. That year, Richard Ribbentrop resigned from the German Imperial Army. He had many doubts about the course of German policy under the rule of the Kaiser Wilhelm II, and a bout of conscience led to his resignation, which his commanding officers asked him to reconsider, but which he pressed ahead with anyway. Thereafter, the family entered a new period of nomadic wandering throughout Europe and even further afield. For a time, they lived in Switzerland, at the town of Arosa, followed by a brief stint in Britain, a country which Joachim developed an affinity for before they relocated to Canada in 1910. By now, Joachim was entering his adult years, and in the early 1910s, he took on a number of jobs while in Canada. For a while, he worked at the Molson's Bank in the city of Montreal, and then for an engineering firm which was engaged in rebuilding the Quebec Bridge over the St. Lawrence River. He also went south of the border and was briefly employed as a journalist in New York City and Boston. Throughout these years, Joachim was traveling widely and had also learned to speak English. His abilities with language and familiarity with a number of other countries in Europe and North America would become one of the main reasons behind his ascendancy in Germany many years later. The Ribbentrops were traveling around Europe and North America at a time when there was increasing tensions between some of the countries they were visiting. Joachim's own birth country, Germany, had been formed out of a few dozen smaller German states as recently as 1871. The new nation, which included both modern-day Germany and much of Western Poland, was quickly viewed as a threat by the other European powers, a rivalry that was compounded by the European powers scrambling for control of Africa and much of Asia. By the early 20th century, two major alliances had developed across the continent as a result of these tensions. One was headed by Germany and included the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy, while on the other side, Britain, France, and Russia had formed a triple entente. By the time the Ribbentrops were living in Canada, Britain and Germany were involved in a naval arms race, while Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire clashed in the Balkans, where both sought to secure greater influence during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Thus, by the early 1910s, Europe was a powder keg and was on the verge of a major war. This tension finally spilled over in the summer of 1914. On the 28th of June, the heir to the Empire of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serb nationalist called Gavrilo Princip while conducting an official visit to the city of Sarajevo. A regional crisis developed between the Austro-Hungarians and Serbia, but this escalated when the government in Vienna made it clear that they wanted to intervene in Serbia's domestic affairs to conduct an investigation. Russia made it clear that it would move to support the Serb government, and during the course of July 1914, all of the other major European powers made clear their intention to also become involved if the situation escalated into military conflict. This is exactly what happened, and in early August 1914, an alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire ended up at war with Britain, France, and Russia. As these events unfolded, Ribbentrop was in Canada, a member of the British Commonwealth, and a country now at war with Germany. To avoid being detained as a German national, Ribbentrop crossed the border to the United States, where he quickly sailed from New Jersey back to Europe. Ribbentrop enlisted in the German Imperial Army upon his return to Europe. The war which followed between 1914 and 1918 was a strange conflict, much of it fought over a few miles of land in northeastern France, with other smaller fronts in the Alps and Eastern Europe. In his memoirs, written many years later, Ribbentrop described his war service as follows: 4 weeks after my enlistment, the first draft moved to the front regiment, but I was not considered worthy of inclusion. I thought the war would be over by the time I had got through my training, but in fact, I fought with this regiment until early in 1918, first on the Eastern and then on the Western Front, except when I was wounded and once when I was seriously ill. The last time I was wounded, in the summer of 1917, I received the Iron Cross First Class. Another notable aspect of his time in service during the war was that towards the end of it, Ribbentrop became friends with a staff officer called Franz von Papen, an association which would have significant implications in later years. But for the time being, in 1917, the United States entered the war on the side of Britain and France. This tipped the conflict in favor of the Western European powers, and with domestic turmoil erupting within Germany, the Kaiser abdicated on the 9th of November 1918. 2 days later, an armistice was signed, and Germany accepted defeat in the conflict. The German Empire came to an end, and a new republic, named after the town of Weimar, was created. Despite the fact that his grandfather and father had both served as career army officers, Ribbentrop did not seek to remain in the military of the new Weimar Republic. Instead, he began a social ascent based on his relationship with Anna Elisabeth Henkel, whom he met for the first time in 1919, shortly after being discharged from the army. The Henkels were a wealthy German family with a large stake in the German wine industry. Through his marriage to Anna in the summer of 1920, Joachim was able to finally acquire the kind of wealth which he had been surrounded by in the moneyed officer class of the German Imperial Army during his childhood at Metz, although the Henkels generally disliked Ribbentrop and disapproved of Anna's choice of partner. However, in 1925, an aunt, Gertrude von Ribbentrop, agreed to adopt 32-year-old Joachim so that he could apply the nobiliary particle von to his name. Thus, Joachim Ribbentrop, the son of a middle-class officer who had struggled financially following his resignation from the army in 1908, had moved within a few short years of the war ending to become Joachim von Ribbentrop, a pseudo-noble and a wealthy member of a family of major German wine merchants. Thereafter, he settled into this upper-middle-class existence in the 1920s, living in Berlin and traveling across Europe selling the Henkel family wine. He and Anna also started a family, which would eventually result in 5 children. While Ribbentrop was selling wine around Europe, a political turmoil was gripping his homeland. In the aftermath of the war, many people in Germany were extremely disaffected. Hundreds of thousands of German men who had fought in the war found it egregious that Germany had accepted the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles, with its stipulations that Germany must disarm and could not maintain any military presence in the Rhineland. Moreover, many Germans who had been career soldiers before the war found themselves out of work due to the reduced size of the German armed forces. Many of these individuals began gravitating to radical political parties in the post-war years. One of these, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, gained quite a following in Bavaria, and under its new leader, an Austrian called Adolf Hitler, even attempted a coup in Munich in November 1923. Although it was quickly suppressed, the Nazis, as they were known in short, would remain a feature of German politics. On the other end of the political spectrum, parties such as the Communist Party of Germany also had a large following during the 1920s. Thus, while the Weimar Republic was largely dominated by centrist parties such as the Social Democratic Party, the country could easily devolve into more extremist politics if the economic or political situation changed. In 1928, Ribbentrop became involved in this shifting political environment for the first time. He was introduced that year to Hitler through a mutual acquaintance. For the Nazi leader's part, he wanted to meet the wine merchant from Berlin, who had contacts within high society in the German capital, and also abroad. Perhaps he could be useful down the line. There is, though, nothing to suggest that Ribbentrop was any kind of swift convert to the Nazi cause. They met and parted, and it would be 4 years before Ribbentrop and his wife joined the Nazi Party. Moreover, throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, Ribbentrop maintained very close relations with many members of the Jewish business community in Berlin. Certainly, the initial forays into meeting with the upper brass of the Nazi Party did not bring out any immediate anti-Semitic feelings which he might have harbored. Indeed, it is clear that in the early days of his involvement with the Nazis in the 1930s, Ribbentrop still believed that the party's anti-Semitic standpoint was a rhetorical device designed to strengthen German demands on territory in Eastern Europe. In time, he would come to see this belief for the delusion that it was. At the time of his initial meeting with Hitler in 1928, neither Ribbentrop nor anyone else could have imagined how central to the German political landscape the Nazi leader would quickly become. In the Reichstag elections of May 1928, the Nazis had received just over 2.5% of the national vote, and this had translated into just 12 seats in the 491-seat Reichstag. But this would all change in the years that followed. After the years of rampant international economic growth known as the Roaring Twenties, the stock exchange and markets on Wall Street in New York City began to take a hammering as the decade drew to a close in the autumn of 1929. Within a few weeks, the global economy was descending into a catastrophic economic recession, which became known as the Great Depression. Germany was hit particularly badly, and as the banking system teetered on the verge of collapse, Germans lost their jobs in droves, followed by their life savings. As feelings hardened in regards to the establishment parties which had run the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, suddenly the Nazis, communists, and other radical political groups prospered at the polls. When new elections were held in September 1930, the Nazis became the second largest party in the country, taking nearly 20% of the seats in the Reichstag. During the early 1930s, things did not improve in Germany. Unemployment rose to nearly 30%, and many people were now resorting to barter as the Reichsmark had effectively lost all of its value. Thus, when new elections were held yet again in July 1932, these resulted in an even more polarized Reichstag. Now the Nazis were the largest party in Germany. Their message of resentment and anger had become increasingly popular, and they managed to secure 37% of the vote nationally, their best ever election result, and one which translated into 230 seats in an expanded Reichstag of 608 seats. However, this was not enough to secure power, and the rise of the Communist Party of Germany to secure third position and 89 seats in the Reichstag ensured that the parliament was split between right-wing and left-wing blocs. Clearly, the Nazis had the biggest mandate in the country, but they had not acquired a majority of the vote, and a great many people distrusted their motives and goals. In this impasse, the president, Paul von Hindenburg, elected to appoint a minority government of largely centrist and center-right independents. It was headed by Franz von Papen as chancellor, the former army officer whom Ribbentrop had met and befriended 15 years earlier during the First World War. This old connection would bring Ribbentrop into the center of the Nazi Party. Following von Papen's appointment as chancellor, he could not simply ignore the Nazis. for whom nearly 2 out of every 5 people in Germany had voted. But relations between the Chancellor and the Nazi leader were tense, and they often needed intermediaries for their negotiations, one of the key aspects of which was discussion of how the further rise of the German communists could be avoided. Thus, in the early autumn of 1932, Ribbentrop, who had finally joined the Nazi Party on the 1st of May 1932, was requested to become involved in negotiations between the leader of the party he had just joined and his old acquaintance von Papen. Even at this point, Ribbentrop appears to have been a political moderate, and it seems clear that his full conversion to the Nazi cause occurred during the events of late 1932, which he was a central player in. When he arrived at the Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, he found Hitler to be very agitated with von Papen's unwillingness to concede the position of Chancellor of the Reich to him. But the Nazi leader explained to Ribbentrop that he was willing to enter into a coalition if this were allowed. Ribbentrop later claimed in his memoirs that by the end of the meeting, he had become convinced that Hitler was the only individual who could save Germany from the communist threat. While the negotiations in the autumn of 1932 had allowed Ribbentrop to move closer to Hitler, they ultimately failed. As a result, new elections were again called for in November 1932, just 4 months after the last national vote. In this, the Nazis and the Social Democratic Party both lost seats, the Nazi vote falling from 37% to 33%. The Communists gained, only marginally, but enough that Hitler was able in the winter of 1932 to further stoke fears that the left-wing parties were gaining at the expense of the right. Thus, when General Kurt von Schleicher became Chancellor in December 1932, negotiations were recommenced between Hitler, von Papen, and a coalition of political centrists and members of the business community to find an arrangement which could shore up the political system against the communists. Ribbentrop was central to these negotiations, and one of the key meetings was held at his home in Berlin on the 22nd of January 1933. Here, von Papen first conceded that he would support Hitler's candidacy to become Chancellor of Germany under certain conditions. The meeting at Ribbentrop's Berlin residence was the beginning of the end for the Weimar Republic, which had governed Germany since 1919. A week later, with von Papen and many others now urging him to do so, President Hindenburg finally appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January. Within weeks, the Nazis moved to secure complete control of the state. New elections were called for on the 5th of March, with their paramilitary wing, the SA, terrorizing voters across Germany. The Nazis managed to win 44% of the vote, up 11% on the previous November. Moreover, days earlier, a fire had broken out in the Reichstag, and Hitler had blamed the event on communist subversives. He now used this incident in late March to pass an enabling act, which effectively allowed Hitler and the Nazi Party to rule by decree. Thus, the Weimar Republic was dead, within weeks of Hitler being appointed as Chancellor, and Ribbentrop would soon be rewarded for his role in bringing about Hitler's ascent. He now became a close confidant of the Chancellor, one who was well liked by Hitler on account of his willingness to consistently agree with Hitler's ideas, and also because of the Nazi leader's belief that Ribbentrop's travels in his younger years made him well qualified to comment on foreign policy matters. This quick ascent into Hitler's good graces in 1932 and early 1933 saw Ribbentrop gaining official appointments as a diplomat for the new Nazi regime. In the early years of the regime, much of Ribbentrop's focus was on the issue of German rearmament. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end, Germany was required to drastically scale back its army and virtually dismantle its air force and much of its navy. The Nazis were committed to overturning this situation as soon as they entered government, and in 1934, Ribbentrop was appointed as a special commissioner by Hitler in relation to the disarmament issue. By the autumn of 1934, he was running his own bureau known as the Dienststelle Ribbentrop, or the Ribbentrop Bureau, parallel to the German Foreign Office, overseen by the Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath, a legacy foreign minister who had been appointed in 1932, before Hitler assumed power. In the mid-1930s, Ribbentrop was responsible for conducting diplomacy with France, Britain, and other European nations to convince them that Germany wanted peace, even as the country was rapidly rebuilding its military, navy, and air force. Ribbentrop gained a further promotion in 1935 when he was appointed as the Reich Ambassador Plenipotentiary at Large, a position within the German diplomatic corps that was only subordinate to the foreign minister. In this capacity, Ribbentrop oversaw the negotiations surrounding two diplomatic agreements which Nazi Germany entered into in 1935 and 1936. The first of these was the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which was arrived at in June 1935. Through this, Germany agreed, in theory, to keep the tonnage of its navy, the Kriegsmarine, at 35% of that of the British Royal Navy. This agreement was drawn up at a time when Hitler strongly believed that an alliance with Britain was still possible, and was also entered into as a supposed gesture of goodwill by the Nazis to convince Britain and France to agree to dispense with other aspects of the Treaty of Versailles. As part of these negotiations, Ribbentrop used the ploy that Germany wanted restoration of the colonies it had possessed in East Africa prior to the First World War as a bargaining tool to bring about the agreement. In the long run, the agreement was perhaps most significant in terms of the limited British reaction 9 months later in March of 1936, when Germany remilitarized the Rhineland region of Western Germany, which it had been prohibited from doing under the terms of Versailles. The second international agreement which Ribbentrop orchestrated at this time was the Anti-Comintern Pact. This was finalized in November 1936 between Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. The full title of the treaty was the Agreement Against the Communist International, and it was effectively a coalition of right-wing governments against the Soviet Union. Benito Mussolini's Italy joined in 1937, followed by General Franco's new fascist regime in Spain in 1939, as well as Hungary. The agreement was politically important for subsequent events, as it moved Germany and Japan, and later Italy, closer together in ways which would have major consequences once the coming war began in 1939. It also signaled the full ascent of von Ribbentrop as Germany's senior diplomat. Von Neurath remained as foreign minister, but he had favored a pro-China stance in terms of the conflict in the Far East, which had been underway between China and Japan since the early 1930s. Thus, Ribbentrop's negotiation of the Anti-Comintern Pact highlighted that von Neurath was now a lame duck minister, and Ribbentrop was the real power in terms of the oversight of foreign affairs within the Nazi regime. In August 1936, just as the Anti-Comintern Pact was being concluded, Ribbentrop was appointed as Germany's ambassador to Britain. Hitler had commanded him to try to forge good relations in London with a view to carving out an alliance between Britain and Germany. This seems, in retrospect, like a strange hope for the German Chancellor to have had in the mid-1930s, but it is in keeping with Hitler's racial views. He viewed the British people as being a fellow Aryan people, who were nearly as racially advanced as the German people. From this perspective, they were a natural ally for Germany, and Hitler considered it to simply be rational that the British would eventually seek to ally with Germany against the communist Slavs of Eastern Europe and other groups that the Nazis viewed as racially inferior. These assumptions were to have a long life in Germany, and, in part, also explains Hitler's decision years later to turn eastwards against Russia in 1941 without first conquering Britain. He simply believed that eventually Britain would end its recalcitrance and ally with Germany against the Soviet Union. Thus, Ribbentrop's mission in 1936 was to sound out an alliance while also explaining away increasing German aggression in Central Europe. Armed with these lofty goals, Ribbentrop headed for London and arrived there in October 1936. His tenure as German ambassador to Britain would last a year and a half and would consist of one diplomatic incident after another. For instance, while visiting Durham Cathedral in November 1936, he mistook some organ music for the German national anthem and gave a Nazi salute, a gesture he repeated when he met King George VI in February 1937. More worryingly, Ribbentrop chose to focus his diplomatic attentions on convincing Britain to either join the Anti-Comintern Pact or return Germany's former colonies in East Africa, the latter being an issue Hitler had no interest in, and which had simply been used as a bargaining chip in the negotiations leading up to the Anglo-German naval agreement. All of these initiatives were dead ends, and by mid-1937, Ribbentrop was generally seen as unintelligent by senior British officials or was thoroughly disliked for his personality. The feeling was mutual, and a year after his appointment as ambassador, Ribbentrop had grown to despise his British hosts. Moreover, he was now beginning to see the alliance with Japan and Italy as something which should be directed against Britain, and that if needs be, an alliance with the Soviet Union should be sought instead of one with London. By 1937, Ribbentrop was considered such a liability by his own staff and members of the British Foreign Office that many people were actively trying to keep him away from London as much as possible in order to avoid any further diplomatic gaffes. One method of doing so was to send him to the English West Country, areas such as Cornwall and Devon. This particular development was to have a bizarre afterstory. Ribbentrop visited here on several occasions during his time in England and stayed on occasion there with Colonel Edward Bolitho, the Lord Lieutenant of Cornwall. There, Ribbentrop developed a deep affection for the region around St. Michael's Mount and St. Ives. Such was the appeal of this part of England, the sunny southwest of the country, that he apparently began petitioning Hitler that at some future date when Britain had been conquered or forced into a junior position within an alliance, that Ribbentrop would be given some of the castles and manor houses he had seen around the West Country, and that he would also be granted Cornwall as a sort of private fiefdom. Hitler had apparently agreed, and Ribbentrop actually began telling people in Cornwall in 1937 that he would one day be the lord of their shire. Interestingly, this would also seem to account for why Cornwall was generally avoided during German bombing missions over Britain during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Ribbentrop's desire to become Lord of Cornwall was that it indicates that he may have hated being in London so much at this point that he viewed the West Country as an idyllic sanctuary. By late 1937, he wanted out of his position as ambassador, and the opportunity to leave finally arose in 1938 when a series of scandals within the German military were used by Hitler as the pretext for removing officials who had been in office prior to 1933. Among them was the foreign minister von Neurath. When von Neurath was removed on the 4th of February 1938, Ribbentrop was appointed as his successor. He came into office just as Nazi Germany's stance in Europe was becoming more and more hostile. Following rearmament and the remilitarization of the Rhineland between 1933 and 1937, the next goal was to achieve superiority in Central Europe. The first step towards this was achieved in March 1938, when Hitler applied military and political pressure on Austria to ensure that the Anschluss, the unification of Germany and Austria into a Greater Germany, was achieved. Ribbentrop, who had just succeeded as foreign minister, did not play a key part in this, but he would in subsequent diplomatic negotiations prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. The first of these initiatives concerned German claims on the Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia with a very large ethnically German population. No sooner had Nazi flags begun flying in Vienna than Hitler and his associates began pressing their claims on the Sudetenland to Britain and France. As diplomatic tensions over the region escalated in the summer and early autumn of 1938, a diplomatic conference was arranged at Munich in September 1938. Germany's foreign minister made an effort at this time to limit Ribbentrop's involvement, as he was deemed too inclined to go to war with Britain, a country he had grown to despise following his ambassadorial tenure there. Thus, Ribbentrop played a limited role in the Munich conference, one which resulted in Britain and France acquiescing to Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland, if he agreed not to seek any further territorial gains in Europe. Ribbentrop did become involved directly afterwards, however, when Hitler and the foreign minister quickly rubbished the agreement and used a mixture of military threats and diplomatic pressure to annex the rest of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. Ribbentrop was nearing the height of his powers at this time, as Hitler had finally realized that an alliance with Britain was impossible, and war with them, which Ribbentrop was eager for, was inevitable if Germany was to continue to expand. Ribbentrop was central to several other diplomatic moves in late 1938 and early 1939. For instance, in mid-March 1939, just as Czechoslovakia was being annexed, Ribbentrop was responsible for contacting the Lithuanian government and demanding that it relinquish control of the city of Memel and the surrounding area which had formed part of Germany prior to the First World War. If they refused, Ribbentrop stated the city of Kaunas, the second largest in Lithuania, would be bombed to the ground. Thus, with a phone call, Ribbentrop acquired this territory for the growing Third Reich. However, in other areas, his blunt approach was far less successful, notably regarding Turkey. Germany was seeking an agreement with the regime there in 1939 to provide it with an ally in the Eastern Mediterranean for the coming war, but Ribbentrop's approach was so heavy-handed that he managed to drive the government there into agreeing a deal with Britain and effectively remaining neutral in the Second World War that would soon break out. However, his failure here was tempered by the finalization of the Pact of Steel in May 1939, whereby Germany and Italy further solidified their political and military alliance. Ribbentrop's foremost political and diplomatic success came a few months later. Ever since his disastrous spell as German ambassador to Britain, Ribbentrop had been convinced that the British were Germany's foremost enemy, and that if necessary, an alliance should be sought with the reviled Bolshevik government of the Soviet Union against London. Now, during the course of 1939, he had been engaged in discussions with his counterpart in Moscow, the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, to that effect. Despite Fascist Germany and Communist Russia being ideological enemies, a deal offered considerable benefits to both sides. For Germany, it would neutralize the threat of war with Russia for some time, so that Hitler could concentrate on defeating Britain and France in Western Europe once war broke out, as it almost certainly would once Germany moved against Poland. Similarly, the experience of its unofficial conflicts with Japan since the mid-1930s around Mongolia and Manchuria in the Far East had demonstrated to the Russian leader Joseph Stalin just how unprepared for a major war the Soviet Union was. Moreover, an agreement would allow the two nations to effectively carve up Poland between them, while Russia could move into Finland and Germany into several other regions. The exact course of the negotiations are not precisely clear, as they were necessarily conducted in secret early on, but by the early summer of 1939 they were well advanced. It was clear that the negotiations were conducted on the understanding that Germany would soon be at war with Poland. In fact, the agreement between Berlin and Moscow was only formally concluded less than 2 weeks before Germany invaded Poland, and clearly Hitler had been waiting for an agreement to be reached before moving against Germany's eastern neighbor. Thus, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, named after the foreign ministers who negotiated it, was concluded on the 23rd of August 1939. Its main terms, as advertised to the international community, were that it was a guarantee of peace between Germany and the Soviet Union, but equally significant was the secret protocol kept private between the two nations. This involved a division of the countries lying between Germany and Russia, between the two powers, once the war began. Poland would be divided up, with Germany taking its western half and the Soviets the east, while Germany would also control Lithuania, leaving Estonia and Latvia for the Soviets. Another clause allowed for the Soviets to invade and occupy Finland, on the understanding that Germany would soon be occupying territories in Western Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement sent shockwaves throughout the international community. After all, fascism and communism were ideological opposites, and much of Nazi rhetoric over the years had been about the coming clash with the Bolsheviks of Russia. Britain and France were taken especially by surprise, as in their preparations for war with Germany, they had assumed that following a German invasion of Poland, Hitler would be faced with the difficulty of having the Soviet Union on his eastern border. This risk was now diminished, and Britain and France's position was weakened considerably as a result. All of this was in the context of continued German demands on Polish territory, which were intended solely to provoke war. In response, Britain hastily put together a defense pact with Poland and announced it on the 25th of August, 2 days after the announcement of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. However, this did nothing to deter Hitler. On the 1st of September, after a false flag event designed to provide some surface justification for the enterprise, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany in response. 2 weeks after that, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland in order to occupy the area agreed to with Germany in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. The success of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement and the invasion and occupation of Poland, which occurred in the weeks that followed, saw Ribbentrop rise to a position of considerable power within the Nazi regime. His star would remain in the ascendant for the next 2 years. His diplomatic coup with the Soviets was the background against which Germany launched the Second World War, and, in its early stages, that war went extremely well for Germany. Following the conquest of Poland in late 1939, the Nazis turned north and west, conquering Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940, and then roaring westwards into the Low Countries and France in the early summer. By the autumn of 1940, the Blitz of Britain from the air and efforts to strangle the country through a naval blockade of the North Atlantic were underway, and Nazi flags were flying everywhere, from western France to Warsaw in Poland. Ribbentrop's agreement with the Russians had provided a window for the Nazis to quickly conquer much of mainland Europe. Consequently, the German foreign minister reached the peak of his powers between 1939 and 1941, with Hitler holding him in extremely high regard throughout this time. The early 1940s saw Ribbentrop largely handling affairs with Germany's allies in the war. With the conflict now fully underway, the time for negotiations with countries like Britain and France was over. A more pressing issue was getting Italy to honour the Pact of Steel and join the war, which it eventually did in June of 1940. Once this occurred, Ribbentrop was involved in efforts to occupy the various nations of the Balkans through diplomatic pressure. This attempt failed, however, and the region was jointly invaded by Germany and Italy. There were also concerns about the situation in the Pacific, where Germany's ally Japan was becoming ever more jingoistic in its approach to the United States. From 1940 onwards, Ribbentrop was working towards the failure of negotiations between the two Pacific powers, and for Japan to attack America. In contrast to his shrewd analysis in 1939 that an accord with the Soviets was advisable, this latter view on America showed very poor judgment on Ribbentrop's part, and when Japan eventually attacked America in December 1941, it brought the United States into the war in ways that would tip the balance of the war in favor of the Allies. Ultimately, it was not the entry of the United States into the war which saw Ribbentrop's influence in the Nazi regime begin to decline. Rather, the decision 6 months earlier by Hitler to tear up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement and invade the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 had seen Ribbentrop's influence within the regime decline dramatically. This decision by Hitler to leave Britain undefeated in the West and instead invade Russia in the East went against everything Ribbentrop had worked for since early 1939. To prevent it, the foreign minister had even suggested that Germany should have tried to bring the Soviet Union into the war against Britain on its side. However, Hitler had started to act according to his own ideological desire to destroy the Soviet Union in 1941, where previously in 1939 he had behaved strategically. The result in this change of tactics was disastrous for the Nazi war effort. After several months of initial successes, which brought massive German armies to the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad, the onslaught stalled in the winter of 1941, and after a calamitous loss at the Battle of Stalingrad the following autumn and winter, the Russians began to push the Germans back towards Poland early in 1943. By that time, it was clear that Germany would eventually lose the war. The events of 1941 and 1942 saw Ribbentrop falling increasingly out of favor with Hitler and losing much of his influence within the Third Reich. His ascendancy since 1939 had been based on the accord with the Soviet Union, and his efforts to preserve the agreement in 1940 and 1941 placed him at odds with Hitler for the first time, a figure that he had ingratiated himself with over the years by always agreeing with his ideas. Moreover, beyond the damage this had caused to his personal relationship with the Führer, the simple fact was that as the war went on, Ribbentrop simply found himself with fewer and fewer opportunities to make an impression on the international stage. As foreign minister, his job was to engage in diplomacy, but by 1942, Germany had severed diplomatic relations with a vast number of countries around the world. Beyond its own allies of Italy, Japan, and the Central European states such as Hungary, it only maintained diplomatic ties with countries such as Ireland, Spain, Switzerland, and Sweden in Europe, which had all remained neutral. As a result, there wasn't an initiative Ribbentrop could engage in to try to rebuild his influence. Moreover, Hitler was said to have found him increasingly tiresome to be around and deliberately tried to avoid meetings with the foreign minister, whom he had once found so affable. Ribbentrop's role in the Holocaust of Europe's Jewish population, which was occurring from 1941 onwards, and indeed his wider attitude towards the Jewish people, has been a matter of some debate. As we have seen, in his earlier life as a wine merchant, Ribbentrop knew and worked with many Jewish business people in Berlin, and indeed in the early days of the Nazi regime in 1933, he had even organized a lunch for some Jewish colleagues to tell them that the expressed anti-Jewish sentiments of the Nazi Party was largely just rhetoric. Yet he soon learned that that was decidedly not the case. As he came to this realization, he started making public expressions of anti-Semitism himself, and, during the war, Ribbentrop was responsible for applying diplomatic pressure through the Foreign Office on places such as Vichy, France, to identify and apprehend any Jewish people living there and send them to the death camps such as Auschwitz and Treblinka across Central and Eastern Europe, where the Nazi regime was engaging in mass murder. Because of the contrast between his earlier relations with the Jewish business community in Germany and his later actions, it is generally believed by historians that Ribbentrop's anti-Semitism was largely feigned in order to ingratiate himself with Hitler. But this matters little when appraising him today. The reality is that, whatever his own personal views, Ribbentrop contributed substantially to the Holocaust through his actions. Von Ribbentrop found himself dispatched to the political wilderness as the war was heading into its final stages. In June 1944, the Western Allies, led by the United States, Britain and Canada, finally opened the long-awaited Western Front with the D-Day landings in northern France. After some resistance, the German hold on France quickly collapsed in August 1944, and by the end of that month, Paris had been liberated, with a separate invasion in the south of the country, resulting in the Germans being pushed out of the entire region. The stage was now set for a push into eastern France in the autumn and then western Germany in the winter. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Russians continued to push the Germans back through Ukraine, the Baltic states, and then Poland. By January 1945, they were amassing their armies in western Poland for the final push towards Berlin in the early spring of 1945. The new year brought a push by both sides to break into Germany as quickly as possible. Yet Hitler would not sanction any talk of surrender, such as might have involved Ribbentrop as the foreign minister. It was simply a race to see if the Russians or the Americans and the British could seize Berlin first. Ribbentrop's final months as German foreign minister led to whatever remaining influence he had completely evaporating. By now, with no diplomatic victories left to be won, he found himself trying to secure Hitler's favor by devoting himself energetically to the Third Reich's genocidal policies, even as it collapsed. This did not have the desired effect, and his star waned even further in the summer of 1944, when many staff of the Foreign Office were implicated in a conspiracy launched by members of the German army to try to kill Hitler and negotiate a surrender to the Allies in July 1944. Ribbentrop was certainly not personally involved, but it reflected poorly on him that individuals with whom he had worked were complicit in the attempted coup. By the closing months of 1944, he was openly derided by some of his colleagues within the government, most of whom had always despised Ribbentrop but had tolerated him as one of Hitler's favoured officials. Yet he lost even that in the end. Although Ribbentrop was invited to attend the Chancellor's 56th birthday party in Berlin on the 20th of April 1945, when he requested a personal audience with Hitler a few days later, he was refused and told that Hitler had matters of actual consequence to attend to. By that time, in April 1945, Berlin was surrounded by the Russians, and the Americans and British were rapidly progressing through central Germany, trying to make it to the capital themselves before the war ended, with civilians including boys and elderly men having been armed by the Nazi regime. In an attempt to defend central Berlin, Hitler decided not to fight himself and instead committed suicide in the bunker of the Reichschancellery on the 30th of April 1945. His appointed successor, the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, killed himself a day later, along with his wife and children. With the war effectively over, the heads of the German government fled Berlin to the north of Germany, to the town of Flensburg on the Danish border, where Allied troops had not yet penetrated. There, the new president of Germany, Admiral Karl Donitz, organized the country's surrender to the Allies, and on the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. Ribbentrop, who had fled north towards Flensburg himself, had offered his services to Donitz, but was rejected. He now found himself a fugitive and, as a leading minister of the Nazi regime, was one of the top targets for apprehension. Consequently, it did not take long to find him, and on the 14th of June 1945, he was arrested in the northern port city of Hamburg. Ribbentrop would now face prosecution as one of the senior members of the regime. The decision had been taken by the Allies prior to the final push towards Berlin that only certain groups within Germany would suffer reprisals for the country's actions during the war. These were largely restricted to senior members of the Nazi Party and regime, and also the SS, the paramilitary organization which had run the concentration camp system across Europe, resulting in the murder of millions of Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and many others. As the German foreign minister from 1938 to 1945, Ribbentrop was scheduled to be tried amongst a group of the leading surviving Nazis. These included Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, Albert Speer, the armaments minister, Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the Wehrmacht and the de facto Minister for Defense for the entire period of the war, and Hans Frank, the head of the General Government of Poland, the Nazi occupation government established in 1939. These were each accused of having contributed to the outbreak of the Second World War and of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity by managing the war and being complicit in the running of the concentration camp system. These individuals went on trial in the German city of Nuremberg late in 1945, so chosen because it was here that the Nazis had held their massive annual rallies during the 1930s. The trial lasted for 11 months. Ribbentrop's counsel attempted to depict him as being a stooge of sorts, a powerless foreign minister whose department was effectively run by Hitler. They also tried to suggest that Ribbentrop himself had been deceived by the claims Hitler made between 1933 and 1939, that he wanted peace in Europe, while allowing Germany to re-establish its dignity. The tribunal rejected these arguments out of hand, claiming it was not plausible that someone as central to the Nazi regime could have been unaware of the aggressive nature of Hitler's plans for Europe. Moreover, they highlighted Ribbentrop's centrality to both the Anschluss of Austria and the events leading to the virtual annexation of Czechoslovakia in late 1938 and early 1939, as well as his absolutely critical role in the events leading up to the invasion of Poland and the outbreak of the war in the autumn of 1939. Thus, when the decisions finally came at Nuremberg in October 1946, Ribbentrop was found guilty on all 4 counts of crimes against peace, planning a war of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Like several others such as Göring, Frank, and Keitel, he was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentences on those who were condemned to death at the first trial at Nuremberg were to be carried out in a block of executions on the 16th of October 1946, just days after the trial concluded. The hangings were to be carried out at the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison, using the standard drop method. Many of those who had stood trial with Ribbentrop, such as Speer and Ribbentrop's predecessor as Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath, had been given custodial sentences and avoided death. Ribbentrop was among a group of 11, which included Frank, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the most senior surviving member of the SS, and Wilhelm Keitel, who were due to be hanged that day. But the number was reduced to 10 when Hermann Göring, the most senior surviving member of the Nazi regime, committed suicide by taking a potassium cyanide capsule on the night of the 15th. As a result, Ribbentrop was the first of the group of 10 to be executed, in a bizarre last act which in no way reflected his personal actions over the previous 12 years. His last words called for the reunification of Germany and declared that, quote, "I wish peace to the world." Afterwards, Ribbentrop's body and those of the other 9 and Göring were taken to the crematorium at Ostfriedhof in Munich and cremated, before their ashes were scattered in the river Isar in southern Bavaria to prevent any graves or monuments to them becoming Nazi shrines. Joachim von Ribbentrop was one of the most peculiar senior members of the Nazi regime. His background was not that of an individual who had encountered professional and personal failures during his youth and, as a result, had become bitter towards society, as was largely the case with Hitler and Joseph Goebbels. Rather, Ribbentrop was a late convert to Nazism, only embracing the party in 1932 on the eve of its ascent to power. Prior to this, he had simply been a dilettante with pretensions to nobility, albeit an individual whose entry into high society was obtained almost entirely through family and marital connections, rather than his own work or talent. Moreover, he displayed no particular ideological bent after 1933. Rather, his senior role within the party was obtained almost entirely through his personal relationship with Hitler. As a sycophant and a yes man, Hitler liked having Ribbentrop around because he simply agreed with whatever he proposed nearly all of the time. It was this relationship which allowed Ribbentrop to rise with great speed within the Nazi hierarchy, first being appointed as ambassador to Britain, and then succeeding as the foreign minister in early 1938. What is most striking about Ribbentrop is that, having been appointed as foreign minister, he managed to score a number of notable successes in his first years in that position, despite his general lack of ability and unpleasant character. He could, for instance, lay claim to some extent to Germany's virtual conquest of Central Europe during the course of 1938 and early 1939. Largely through diplomatic agreements such as that reached with Britain at Munich in the autumn of 1938. But surely his greatest success was in negotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with his Russian counterpart. This provided the means for Germany to conquer much of Europe in the 12 months that followed, and had Hitler not decided to scrap the agreement in 1941 and invade Russia, there is a possibility that Germany could have emerged from the war largely victorious. Instead, he did invade Russia, and this, combined with the entry of the United States into the war in December 1941, doomed Germany to military defeat, as diplomatic negotiations became pointless, and as Hitler's view of Ribbentrop declined precipitously. The foreign minister became a peripheral figure in the Nazi regime. Despite all of this, there is no doubting Ribbentrop's complicity in the crimes of the Nazi regime, both in fomenting the war and in committing numerous atrocities, while it is also clear that he knew perfectly well what was occurring at the death camps throughout Europe and facilitated the Holocaust. It was, in the end, entirely fitting that, despite his tepid ideological adherence to Nazism, he was amongst the first leaders of the regime to be prosecuted and found guilty at Nuremberg. What do you think of Joachim von Ribbentrop? Was he an individual who did great harm in fomenting much of the Second World War, or was he simply a sycophant of Hitler's who found himself rising to a position of major power as a result? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.